Chapter 624. The Moonwheel capital, the capital of the Saint Hien Empire, was the birthplace of Elven Empress Athena I. The elves had chosen this place as a place of revival that gave them hope. Naturally, this place had many natural advantages. The Moonwheel capital was located in the core area of the magical Fallen Star Forest. Plus, the Moonwheel capital had been here for many years, and it already had a large number of mana pools and magic traps. Since the elves were the children of nature, the forest had a special meaning to them. The dense forest would forever be the elves' strongest ally. The elves' subordinates, the centaurs, forest dwarfs, and other natural creatures all lived here. Also, the incredibly rare moon elves lived in the Fallen Star Forest. The moon elves were elves, but they also weren't elves. Only the elves' strongest warriors and mags would be able to leave their souls behind in this forest when their lifespans were about to come to an end. The Fallen Star Forest was a special realm to begin with. Pure souls would be enveloped by starlight here, transforming into shining undying warriors. Alright then, according to undead mags, this was a type of undead creature. However, the elves believed that this was another form of existence from their ancestor, the Valkyrie. If you asked me, wasn't the Valkyrie still an undead creature? They would often suddenly appear at night and patrol the forest's borders, punishing poachers and invaders. They would transform into starlight again under the moonlight, and would have astonishing power in the forest. And, this was only the Fallen Star Forest's regular defense force. In the past, the Sun and Moonwheel capital's defenses would be carried out in silence in the forest. But now, the silence here had long since been broken. Busy scenes could be seen everywhere. The forest that used to only be able to taste the moonlight and the chirping of insects at night had awakened. White-robed priests and druids were everywhere under the protection of guards. Under the hostile gazes of the moon elves, they chose towering trees that had a long history. Ancient oaths and poems were repeated. In a mystical white light, the earth shook, and countless pieces of mud and stone were transformed into dust. The treants stood up, their roots transforming into giant feet, and their treetops transforming into heads. Ancient war trees that could move and fight could be seen everywhere in the forest. The entire forest seemed to come to life. The towering treants all stood up. They didn't need anyone to command them as they slowly advanced with heavy footsteps. However, their footsteps were heavy and ancient, and their sighs were filled with sorrow. Even if they survive the calamity, the Fallen Star Forest will be finished. The young white-robed Druil looked at the powerful giants. Their footsteps were enough to create an earthquake, but he himself was shedding tears. A treant that could transform into an ancient war tree meant that it had evolved from a plant to an intelligent being. Even with Druil's guidance, it was still an ancient tree that had endured for thousands of years. Even though the Fallen Star Forest could be traced back to the Elven Empire's era, there was still a limit to the number of such ancient trees that had been lost in battle. And now, Druil and the Nature Priest had summoned an army of almost 10,000 treants. In that case, let alone 100-year-old trees, even trees that were only a few decades old would be used. Not only would the summoned treants have low intelligence, it would also be impossible for them to become complete treants. Without the support of the earth, the Trent's lifespans would soon come to an end. Such a loss would be impossible to make up for. Large swathes of the forest were withering and dying. Using the power of nature to forcefully raise ancient war trees was an obvious violation of all the teachings of nature. This was also forcing this ancient forest to enter an early Armageddon. Many Druil and nature priests were shedding tears. It was likely that even if they survived this calamity, they would never be able to rest easy in their next lives. It was inevitable that their power levels would decrease, and it was possible that they would commit suicide on a large scale. Fortunately, this was the Moon Elves' forest. If this had been a forest created by the Wood Elves, it was likely that the Wood Elves would rather have their entire species perish than force the forest to perish. But looking at it from a different perspective, if this was truly the Wood Elves' forest, there would be far more ancient trees and nature creatures. The Wood Elves' fear of death would cause the forest to proactively fight for them, and there would be no need to forcefully raise ancient war trees. Treants and ancient war trees were incredibly important among the elves' large-scale combat units. The elves were rich in mags and archers. However, even the famous Silver Moon Rangers among the elves were more proficient in combat based on agility. They would be at a disadvantage if they tried to block the enemy's powerful units head-on. The elves lacked meat shields, or perhaps powerful cannon fodder. This was a glaring weakness of the elves since ancient times. This weakness wouldn't be obvious in small-scale battles, but it was constantly exposed on a major battlefield. No matter if it was the humans' incredibly powerful cavalry charge or the beastman berserkers' bloody chaotic battles, the elves' battle formations would always be mysteriously broken through countless times. In the end, the elves would lose the battle and only be able to remain depressed. The warriors in the front row had all fallen. No matter how strong the archers and mags in the back row were, they were just waiting to be harvested. The elves were used to using summoned creatures, vassal species, and treants as meat shields. However, these cannon fodder's combat strength and fighting spirit were truly worrisome. The only reliable treants and ancient war trees required a large amount of resources and time to nurture. Not only would any of them die, they also had the fatal weakness of incredibly slow movement speed. In the past battles, many of the elves' enemies would either change the battlefield or go around the Trent's line of defense, easily ignoring the powerful defense of the ancient war treants. However, this time, the ancient war treants might be able to play a big role in a defensive and positional battle. However, the Moon Elves' forceful activation of the ancient war trees was the equivalent of severing their combat potential for the next several hundred years. Of course, if the Moon Elves didn't go all out, it was likely that they would have no future. It was also worth mentioning that due to the Moon Elves' usual way of doing things, they didn't value other species at all in their territory. Even the Moon Elves' traditional vassal species didn't have many forest dwarfs living in the forest. There were even fewer centaurs capable of melee and ranged combat. In the end, the Moon Elves could only rely on themselves. If it weren't for the fact that they were in dire straits, the Moon Elves wouldn't have committed such a crime that would definitely offend all Druil and the Wood Elves. Suddenly, a mountain wall started trembling as grey dirt fell down like rain. The next instant, that pitch-black mountain wall actually transformed into a black treant covered in dirt. This treant was several hundred meters tall. The moment it appeared and activated its domain, the entire sky was covered in dark clouds as a rainstorm began. Countless raindrops nourished his withered tree trunk, washing away the mud on his body. Dark green sprouts grew at a speed visible to the naked eye. His closed eyes opened, but they were filled with a sorrowful silver light. Wall of despair? Didn't he receive a fatal injury in the Yungya War more than 100 years ago? Dragonsteel Guardian and Aina's Anchor? Why have they all awakened? Do they not intend to live anymore? As the elder treant let out a sorrowful cry, all the legendary treants woke up from their long slumber to welcome their fates and their end. Druil Sar couldn't believe his eyes as he looked at this scene. These weren't treants that had been forcefully awakened. These were treants that had been severely injured in the previous battle. Not even the most outstanding nature priest would be able to heal their injuries. They could only extend their lives through long slumber and wait for a miracle to arrive. But now, all of them were awakened. It was likely that they realized that a miracle hadn't arrived yet, and that the final moment had arrived. The Starfall Forest is completely finished. Several hundred Druil Sar and priestesses surrounded the treants. Green and white light that represented healing kept flashing on the Trent's bodies. However, this would only be able to temporarily extend the Trent's lives. No. The elders won't be able to stay active for much longer. Could it be that the demon wave is about to arrive? Druil Sar looked up at the sky in disbelief. The darkness of midnight had been shattered, and the moonlight that guided the Moon Elves forward had been blocked by dark clouds. Countless cracks had appeared in space, and these cracks were constantly spreading. The aura of chaos that brought destruction was already flowing out. A wild wolf came into contact with this aura, and its body distorted as it transformed into a filthy and warty berserk wolf. This berserk wolf directly pounced at its brethren. Even more aura of chaos descended as large numbers of wild beasts transformed into dangerous magical beasts of hell. The information is true. The Holy War has begun. Chapter 625. Even though dawn was about to arrive, Pitch-black clouds still covered the sky. It was as if misfortune was hanging over all the elves' hearts. Ranger's eagle vision and Mag's long-range vision spells could see the cracks in the sky so clearly. The aura of chaos flowing out of the cracks caused everyone to instinctively feel nauseous and afraid. The moment the aura of the chaos abyss arrived in this world, it brought a great deal of trouble to the mortal plane's residents. Normally docile domestic pigs were being demonized, but they swiftly transformed into incredibly aggressive demonized wild boars. Large numbers of demonized wild beasts appeared in the suburbs. These wild beasts instinctively attacked living creatures before them, tearing them apart and devouring them, using a strange method to achieve self-evolution. By now, nobody doubted the prophecy of the demon wave's arrival anymore. The eternal sun and moon have been blocked by dark clouds. Countless cracks have appeared in the pitch-black sky. The aura of the wind spirits is filled with the smell of rot and sulfur. Even the clean water in our tanks has become rotten and dirty. Livestock are beginning to demonize. This is exactly the same as the omens of the demon wave recorded in the history books. Venerated Anslow, why do the elves have to suffer so much misfortune? Are we unable to escape from Armageddon? At this point, any lies that could reassure the elves would become meaningless. Even though the elves wouldn't admit that the prophecy was true, some elderly elves among the elves had been lucky enough to survive the previous holy war. They had managed to survive the chaos abyss to this day. How could they not remember the aura of the chaos abyss? These symptoms could all be summed up by the fact that there was a high concentration of chaos abyss pollution. And as the demon wave arrived, this world would soon become even more chaos abyss than the chaos abyss. Although the amount of chaos abyss aura that had accumulated this time couldn't compare to the local aura of the chaos abyss, the quality of the aura was far superior. In the past, existences from the chaos abyss would have to go through a filter net created by the power of order. This would take a lot of time and effort, and the final result would still be a projection. But the current holy war, perhaps it would be more accurate to call it a dimensional war. This was a direct connection between the two dimensions. Any dimension that came into contact with the chaos abyss would be corrupted and transformed into the chaos abyss. This was determined by the very nature of the chaos abyss. This was also the reason why the chaos abyss had gradually become the endless chaos abyss. Meanwhile, the mortal plane Aishi represented the origin of order and chaos. It was the most important battlefield for the two major origin powers. Every time the chaos abyss connected with the mortal plane, not only would it be a disaster for the mortal plane, it would also be a disaster for the chaos abyss. The entire chaos abyss was like a bloodthirsty beast that had smelled its prey. It was squirming, roaring, and desperately absorbing the fragrance of the mortal plane. Under its control, a tremendous amount of chaos abyss aura accumulated in the mortal plane's entrance. In fact, the aura had already broken through the mortal plane's limits and reached the mortal plane on the other side. To abyssal creatures, abyssal aura was naturally a good thing. It was a reward from the will of the abyss, and after absorbing it, they would become even more powerful. However, an appropriate amount of hormone nourishment was nourishment and food. If it was too much to be absorbed, it would be poison. Currently, countless chaos abyss species, demons, and devils in the snowy forest area of the 7th level of the chaos abyss had been surrounded by abyssal aura. They were twisting and rolling on the ground in pain, but they were also laughing maniacally in delight as if they had gotten a great deal. Some small demons were unable to withstand the abyssal aura and directly changed their forms. Small demons that had originally been around 1 meter tall twisted and transformed into large demons that were over 3 meters tall. However, their bodies were torn apart and blood kept flowing out. Yet, they didn't feel any pain at all. Their eyes rolled back into their heads as they drooled and crawled on all fours like wild dogs, roaring in the direction of the unknown dimensional door. These were Chaos War slaves, failures that were unable to withstand the power of chaos. Once the dimensional door connecting the Chaos Abyss and the mortal plane opened, these Chaos War slaves would become the first wave of cannon fodder for the demon wave. Their overly strengthened physical bodies would be quite unstable. However, their abundant mana would allow them to detonate themselves at any moment. There was a tremendous number of these Chaos War slaves, and if they met any obstacles, they would use their very lives to destroy everything in front of them. Meanwhile, the victors who successfully ascended through the power of chaos wouldn't be able to leave this place so easily. They were bound by the will of the Chaos Abyss and would also become the vanguard of the Chaos Abyss. The abyssal aura continuously strengthened them, but it also robbed them of their rationality and ability to think. The moment that the dimensional door to the Chaos Abyss opened, their intelligence would only be slightly higher than that of the Chaos War slaves. However, unlike the defeated Chaos War slaves who were destined to become expendable in battle, as long as they were able to survive the first demon wave, it would be possible for them to regain their rationality. In fact, in all the previous holy wars, there were even many powerful demons that reached a bottleneck or were nearing the end of their lifespans. However, they had gambled with their lives on the line and finally succeeded in ascending to become Chaos Lords. The powerful demons that were doing quite well wouldn't approach the mortal plane during this period of time. That would be the equivalent of voluntarily choosing to become cannon fodder. As long as they were close enough, even Chaos Lords would be unable to resist the will of the Chaos Abyss's forceful recruitment. And even if these demons increased their power, it would be even more dangerous if their rationality was weakened. If they wanted to enter the mortal plane to enjoy slaughter and flesh, they could simply wait until the first demon wave ended. Of course, since there were rules, there would definitely be loopholes. Many demons were actively absorbing the aura of the Chaos Abyss in the 7th level Snow Forest region in order to increase their own power. Perhaps they wouldn't be able to absorb much of the aura of the Chaos Abyss, but it would be worth it if they could avoid getting involved in the first demon wave, which was the most dangerous. But even if they were only stealing some leftover resources, they would still have to constantly retreat, and they wouldn't be able to steal for long. That was because as time passed, the chaotic region of the Chaos Abyss would constantly expand. Soon, it would spread from the Snow Forest region to the entire 7th level of the Chaos Abyss. And this wasn't even the end. The nearby 6th and 8th levels would automatically connect with the 7th level, forming an entire dimension. This would become the first Demon Wave's soldier region. Later on, all life in these dimensions would become members of the first Demon Wave, and this entire dimension would be directly connected. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that it was directly connected to the mortal plane. When the Holy War ended, it would be impossible for anyone to return to the Chaos Abyss. The next step would only be activated when the will of the Chaos Abyss and its aura completely covered the entire dimension. At that time, not a single place in the entire Chaos Abyss would be safe. The Chaos Abyss was greedy. It wouldn't believe that this would be enough to invade the entire mortal plane. It would continuously connect with other Chaos Abyss dimensions and have them become new soldiers until the first demon wave ended. The number of levels in the Chaos Abyss was only a special concept in terms of space. The Chaos Abyss wouldn't only choose the nearest level. This was another type of lucky draw. Whichever dimension was chosen would be required to enter the Chaos Abyss. The victors and survivors would receive blessings from the Chaos Abyss, and perhaps the Chaos Abyss did indeed have its own will. Usually, the dimensions that were chosen would be large-scale dimensions with extremely high populations. And when the dimensional door to the mortal plane was opened, the ordinary citizens and imps there would all lose their reason and become cannon fodder. It would be impossible to calculate how many of them would become cannon fodder. This was also the foundational reason why the first demon wave would be nearly impossible to stop. No matter how powerful the country on the other side of the dimensional door was, the first demon wave would destroy that country. That was because the first demon wave would contain all the power of several Chaos Abyss dimensions before they were destroyed. The bloodthirsty residents of the Chaos Abyss would destroy everything in front of them like maniacs. Countless powerful empires in history had been destroyed by the first demon wave. Every single demon wave would be fatal. If the first demon wave was a berserk beast horde that relied purely on instinct to kill, then it would be easier to deal with. Forbidden spells and traps would be able to clear out a large number of cannon fodder. However, there was a black giant sitting cross-legged outside the dimensional door. His obsidian greatsword was still dripping with silver-white god's blood. He was the commander of the first demon wave, Denotes. The Chaos War god was the controller of the first demon wave. Nobody knew how he was able to do this, but he was indeed able to maintain his reason in the first demon wave. He was also able to calmly command the wave of destruction to destroy everything in front of him. In the past, the Chaos War god would always have a large group of Valkyrie guards around him. These guards would become frontline commanders under Donati's protection in the first demon wave, helping to take on the responsibility of commanding the first demon wave. Unfortunately, this time, Donati's would probably be a lone commander. An army with or without a basic commander would be completely different. From a certain standpoint, losing all of the Valkyrie guards in the Hades would indeed be a tremendous loss for the Chaos Abyss. In fact, it would be no less than losing a main god. Currently, the Chaos War god had his eyes closed. He appeared as if he were a gigantic bronze statue in hibernation. He seemed to be in a deep sleep. His breathing was as astonishing as thunder. However, none of the demons around him dared to approach him. Any existence with even the slightest bit of power would be able to sense that Donatis's power level was slowly increasing within the aura of the Chaos Abyss. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that Donatis had recovered to his peak. In the world of high-level combat strength, everyone knew that the Donatis in the first demon wave was the true Chaos War god who could destroy everything. He would tear apart all obstacles, even if they were gods. Chapter 626. This situation doesn't seem right. Since I was intending to do something during the first demon wave, gathering information would naturally be my top priority. But when I put together all the information I had gathered, I discovered that the situation was far from good. Something was even more off. The Chaos Abyss had been far too thorough in their actions this time. For the will of the Chaos Abyss, whose ultimate goal was the evolution of species, pure destruction was only a method, not the ultimate goal. Many of its choices would be quite random. And this time, the will of the Chaos Abyss was showing its true evil intentions. The location of the Chaos Abyss's portal had been far too intentional. That was the elves' final shelter. Encountering the first demon wave, there would basically be a massacre. The location of the portal in the Chaos Abyss was also a major problem. It was located in the 7th level of the Chaos Abyss. Normally, this level wouldn't be a big deal, but if one considered the characteristics of the demon wave and the surrounding levels, it would be easy to see the obvious evil intentions of the Chaos Abyss. The 9th to 13th levels of the Chaos Abyss had originally been Demon Marquis Ladvioka's territory. That's right, the territory of the Lord of Putrefaction who had died in the Battle of the Hades. Ladvioka had died, but more than 20 powerful demons had claimed that they were his descendants and that their true bodies had returned. They were currently fighting over this Chaos Abyss Lord's inheritance. But now, there was no need for them to fight. Based on the demon wave's abnormal downward trend, it was likely that the 9th to 13th levels wouldn't be able to escape. And, it just so happened that these levels were in a bad situation. During the Battle of the Hades, the Lord of Putrefaction had shown us the frightening power of his herding plane. His territory was filled with his creations and creatures from other planes. Although he had previously restricted their movements, these dangerous toys had all gone out of control after he died. Currently, these few levels of the Chaos Abyss were quite dangerous. Nobody knew if a seemingly inconspicuous kitten would suddenly transform into a tiger monster that was several hundred meters long. And, it just so happened that Ladvioka liked to give dangerous creatures the appearance of being cute and harmless. A main god's former territory would definitely be far more dangerous than any ordinary Chaos Abyss. Not to mention, this was the territory of Ladvioka, an expert in raising dangerous creatures. For the elves, this was the worst possible choice. Alright, there was no need for everyone to play guessing games now. These creations would probably all be tossed into the mortal plane. Perhaps after a series of survival of the fittest, a few new stars from the Chaos Abyss would appear. However, this would be a nightmare for the elves. After sorting through all this information, even I felt powerless. The so-called strategic arrangement also depended on the strength and number of chess pieces on both sides. This was just like an old king and a warrior playing against the enemy's 10 sets of chess pieces. No matter how I looked at it, it would only result in death. Learn from the Chaos Abyss's operations. Do you really think you can win just by attacking the opponent? It's so realistic that I can't laugh at it. Competing against the Chaos Abyss in terms of combat potential and energy consumption would probably be the most foolish of actions. I didn't even need to give this information to the elves. The elves should have long since started collecting information. This desperate battle situation would probably force them to use up all their combat reserves, but it was likely that they wouldn't be able to last much longer. How much longer? That'll depend on the Chaos Abyss. But at most, it won't exceed 10 days. Harlois answered my question as she looked at the map. Ever since she met Didina, she had been maintaining her human form. She had also become much more serious, and she was even wearing clothes now. Why did this sound so strange? The current situation was quite obvious. The Chaos Abyss was filled with malice towards the elves and wanted to see them all die. As for the will of the Chaos Abyss, it should be your younger brother. Theoretically speaking, this is indeed a possibility. However, we all know that the guidance of fate is always so difficult to understand. Perhaps your guess is a part of fate itself. I was the one who taught you divination, and you've never even passed. Let's get straight to the point. I could only helplessly take a deep breath. Probably, maybe. Fine, he definitely did it. Did he have a grudge against the elves? Of course he did. One of the main culprits behind the Mist Kingdom's destruction was the elves. I had already taken revenge, but Didina hadn't. Didina's memory wasn't that bad. Only someone who controlled the will of the Chaos Abyss, or at least a portion of it, would be able to do such a thing. I could still remember the image of Didina dragging Cynthia into the void. No evidence. Didina had just beaten up Anslo just 2 days ago. Why else would he injure the main god of the elves? My family's misfortune. As I sighed insincerely, I was constantly trying to guess what Cavendish wanted to do. Perhaps revenge was his goal, but it definitely wouldn't be his ultimate goal. However, I had far too little information right now, so guessing would be meaningless. I should first think about what I needed to do. Did the Northlands send a reply? Yes, they'll do as you say. They should be able to make it in time. We agreed to board the airship in Sindel. They'll go pick up the Silver Elves first, which will be 2 days late. If they can arrive on time by the day after tomorrow, they'll probably arrive at the Moonwheel capital in 1 week. The Silver Elves heading to the Northlands were still quite far away from the Northlands. Renee's Borealis fleet was also on the way, so I decided to have her pick up the Silver Elves. Are you ready to establish the Northlands? Keep everything simple. We'll hold the coronation ceremony as soon as we arrive in Sindel. Diana, Victoria, Swana, and Kelly are all on the way there. I nodded. It would seem that my plan was progressing quite smoothly. By the time we arrived in the small city of Sindel, all 4 superior elf species would be represented. This coronation ceremony wouldn't be too casual. Harlois, you're already prepared to become Elven Empress? Why are you so calm? Because it all happened so quickly, I'm a little numb to it. That's right, the coronation ceremony and the establishment of the Northlands Elven Empire. Although I was already intending to help the elves, how to help them was still a problem. Since the Northlands elves already had hopes of establishing their own Elven Empire, it wouldn't be impossible to establish an Elven Empire. This wouldn't be the first Elven Empire in the Mist Alliance. If we supported the Northlands elves as ordinary human allies, we would be nothing more than a guest army that would be nothing more than cannon fodder. In that case, rather than inexplicably helping the elves for free, it would obviously be better to help the Elven branch as the rightful ruler of the Elven Empire. Not only would this be more in line with righteousness, it would also be much more convenient in practical terms. From the information I had already obtained, it was obvious that directly fighting against the demon wave would be the equivalent of suicide. And if we wanted to organize a retreat, we would likely need to fight for the authority of leadership, which would result in a conflict with the ruler of Moonwheel City. At that time, Elven Empress Harlois would lead the 4 superior elves to suppress the false ruler. I was truly looking forward to it. Even if we were helping the Northlands in their hour of need, we would also be taking advantage of their misfortune. Our assistance wouldn't be for free. We would be using the rightful ruler of the elves in exchange. What? You don't recognize Empress Harlois and the Northlands Elven Empire? Fine, we'll immediately leave. At that time, Either their species would be wiped out, or their country would be destroyed. I was truly looking forward to this scene. However, this was actually nothing more than a cover, because no matter which option they chose, I wouldn't give up on my authority. That was because I knew very well that compared to an undefeatable god, having a useless ally would be far more fatal. If that useless ally had the right to command you, it would be no different from suicide. Stop talking about your younger brother. You're just as petty. Aren't you looking forward to it? Of course Harlois was looking forward to it. She would be able to return to the elves as Empress Harlois, and she would also be able to punish the traitors as her ruler. This would make her so excited that she wouldn't be able to sleep at night. If this had been in the past, she wouldn't have even thought about it. But now that the three-god equipment that symbolized royal authority had appeared, and the Northlands just happened to have gathered 4 superior elf leaders, Harlois truly felt like she was fated to return. I was even looking forward to seeing the superior elves' expressions when the fairies' intelligence organization announced Empress Harlois' return. It would definitely be quite complex. Everything that we were doing now actually had a high level of political meaning. When the Moon Elves had gone overboard, the Northlands' Elven Empire and Empress Harlois hadn't just watched as the traitors were destroyed by the demon wave. Instead, they had even volunteered to help the Moon Elves. In that case, no matter what happened next, this meant that Empress Harlois had no intention of going after the Moon Elves. When considering the elves' terrible past, a magnanimous and powerful empress would be far more likely to be recognized by all the elves. Meanwhile, the Northlands elves, the Northlands Mist Alliance, and the Hades gods would all become Empress Harlois' support. This would be her true strength in fighting for royal authority. The result of this rescue operation would be her first accomplishment. How well she did would directly affect how stable her rightful crown would be. Don't underestimate this crown. Countless elves viewed it as the most supreme existence in their hearts. As long as Harlois obtained this crown, countless elven arcanists, druil, and rangers would voluntarily join her side. From a long-term perspective, no amount of royal authority could compare to this false reputation. In order to deal with the demon wave, the new Borealis had brought along the Mist Alliance's elites. The Northlands elves had also brought their strongest lineup. However, this still wouldn't be enough. In order to fight against the demon wave, which was capable of destroying everything in its path, it would be the stupidest and most suicidal attempt. Even if one could fight against the demon wave for a single day and kill 10,000 demons, would one be able to fight against the entire holy war and kill off all the demons in the chaos abyss? It would be impossible to calculate how long the demon wave would last. That was because every time the demon wave descended, the demon wave would be reduced to rubble. Only chaos demons would remain there. I felt that as long as the will of the chaos abyss commanded the demon wave, there would likely be an endless amount of cannon fodder. In the end, the demon wave's main goal would be to migrate and retreat. For mega empires are working together. The other countries will probably give us some face. I hope so. Not only was Harlois uncertain, there were some things that even I wasn't sure about. The Mist Alliance, Bardi Empire, Ottoman Empire, and Mage Country had all sent a joint request for the elves' human neighbors to open up their borders for refugees to pass through. However, there had been no response yet. If this was a time of peace, a joint request from these 4 major empires would definitely be quite powerful. But now that the demon wave was about to arrive, if all the elves ran away, wouldn't the human neighbors be the ones to take the brunt of the disaster? Open up their borders. Would the demon wave be far behind if the refugees arrived? Using the elves to exhaust the demon wave as much as possible would be the most beneficial choice for the humans. Since the destruction of a country was imminent, what would the other major empires' casual diplomatic requests count for? If it weren't for the fact that they were giving me and the Mist Alliance face, the 3 major empires wouldn't have sent such a request. That was why I didn't wait too long. I was also preparing my other backup plans. I hope that we can make it in time. I'm afraid that it'll be quite difficult. Honestly, I'm so sorry. Marguerite seemed rather embarrassed as she said this. As for the reason, I also think that it'll be quite difficult. It's best that we don't be overly optimistic. Adam added as he took big bites of his rice ball. No matter how I looked at him, He seemed just like a traveling backpacker. You still have the cheek to say such a thing. Didn't you say that you knew the way? I felt that I was incredibly foolish to have allowed a bastard like Adam to lead the way. Where are we now? Did we take the wrong teleportation portal? Which level of the chaos abyss was this barren desert? I looked up at the 3 moons above me and speechlessly asked the heavens, just where exactly was this place? We're lost at such a time. Does the heavens want the moon elves to die? No matter how I look at it, this seems like a man-made disaster. Did you really not intentionally allow him to lead the way? Didina, who had followed me here, was already showing me her evil intentions. Harlois was viciously glaring at me as if she was grinding her teeth. If it wasn't for the fact that she cared about her image, she would have likely bitten me already. I wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. Since I had already confirmed the plan, what was the point of me making a fuss? I really hadn't intended on scamming anyone this time. It was just that Adam was far too confident in his ability to say that he knew the shortcut. Forget it, I'll lead the way. Our Chaos Abyss guide was finally useful. Chapter 627. The 8th year of the Foot Dawn era would be recorded as the year of bloodshed. That was because this was the year that the final Holy War began. The following days were destined to be filled with rivers of blood. Currently, I was in an excellent mood as I looked at the bright sunlight. With Didina's guidance, we finally arrived at the rendezvous location. Of course, this wasn't the reason why I was in such a good mood. You must be in a good mood to be able to get rid of Eliza, right? Nonsense, I'm actually quite sad. Saying that while smiling isn't convincing at all. I need to tell her. Harlois, it's great that father is here, isn't it? How much money will the fairies pay for this explosive information? After a short period of silence, we came to an agreement. The silly cat and I understood each other. Why do people have to hurt each other? The world must be filled with love. We nodded and came to an agreement, and everything was gone with the wind. Fine then, to be more reasonable, it would be better if we didn't all die together. That's right, Eliza had already helplessly left the team. We were using a teleportation portal to the mortal plane. As a demon lord, it would be impossible for her to leave, so she could only temporarily stay in the Chaos Abyss. Regrettably, but happily, this was indeed only temporary. When the demon wave arrived, the mortal plane would be directly connected to the Chaos Abyss. Even Donates would be able to jump out from the Chaos Abyss, let alone Eliza. I also casually gave Eliza some missions to make things difficult for our enemies. However, what was surprising was that Didina, who was also a demon lord, was actually able to easily teleport through the dimensional door. It was as if she didn't care about the dimensional laws at all. Don't be so surprised. Succubi don't have much strength. I'm probably weaker than even a myth-superior elf, nor am I some demon noble. Why would she stop me? Actually, I wasn't the only one who was surprised. Adam, Marguerite, and even Harlois herself were all looking at Didina in astonishment. According to their estimations, since Didina was the immemorial elf emperor, just her inherited memories and knowledge, along with the passage of so many years, should have been more than enough for her to reach the peak of power. He is him, and I am me. Everyone chooses a different way of life. I think it's good now. At least the legendary demons I heard about have fallen, and I don't have to fight. I'm still alive. The reincarnation of a hero might not necessarily be a hero. The reincarnation of a wise and far-sighted saint might also be a butcher. The reincarnation of the reincarnation and reincarnation were two completely different individuals. Logically speaking, this was correct, but I still felt that something was off. Since he was living in the Chaos Abyss, he should have understood the law of the jungle. Succubi were treasures to other species, but to the powerful demons who thought with their muscles, succubi were useless subordinates. Living under someone else's roof and borrowing someone else's power wouldn't be a long-term solution. Who knew when you would meet an idiot who would kill you in order to become famous? Didina didn't seem like such an idiot. Moreover, as long as she absorbed the magic knowledge in her memories, she would be able to become a powerhouse. Her identity as a succubus would not restrict her from practicing magic. I looked over at her, but Harlois shook her head. It wasn't that she didn't know, but rather that she knew what was going on and didn't want me to continue asking. I could only helplessly shrug my shoulders as I inwardly sighed. Ever since Harlois met Didina, she had stopped using her cat form. And if she truly became the Empress, it was likely that her cat form would no longer exist. That won't happen. Even you're capable of leaving everything to me. I can do the same. That might not necessarily be the case. I don't have any official status right now. How could the Empress of a country leave just like that? TSK, what Empress? There's only one gold elf left, and all the superior elves are below me. No matter what I do, I'll still be the symbolic elven Empress. Even if I'm not a puppet, I'll still be nothing more than a flower vase. How boring. I can just leave a clone in the royal palace. Don't even think about getting rid of me. The silly cat suddenly leaned over to me. She was currently 2 heads taller than me, and her exquisite golden crown gave off an air of nobility. Her dress was extravagant, and her golden proportions made her look very feminine. Her blonde hair even had the fragrance of laurel. Cough, Harlois, could you tell me about the latest situation with the elves? I'd like to know which elders are still alive. Perhaps they'll be able to help. Harlois instantly had a bitter expression. How dare you tell your father that the gold elves were already finished? You were such an unfilial child. You deserved it. You deserve to be single for the rest of your life. Little Red's retorts were always so difficult to understand. Right now, she had transformed back into her little red dragon form. However, compared to her previous 1-meter-long infant dragon form, she was now roughly 3 meters long. Little Red had actually gained the most from this short trip to the Chaos Abyss. At her level, it would be incredibly difficult to improve any further. Although Little Red's power level seemed to have regressed for a short period of time, this was basically a change in her species' bloodline. This would greatly increase the upper limits of her combat strength. This was something that would be incredibly difficult to improve no matter how much she cultivated. In a way, this was the same as me changing my bloodline. It was just that Little Red's growth speed was much faster. I had originally come to the Chaos Abyss in search of power. Although my power level had greatly improved, I hadn't made any progress on the 4 most important magic swords apart from accumulating a bunch of fate points. TSK, even if I have fate points, I can't exchange them for blueprints and materials. System, you're so useless. System, the God of Order's abilities were limited. All she could exchange for were equivalent items through karma, items that already existed. For me, who was already forging a new path, her fate points would be of limited help. The Holy War was about to begin. The 4 magic swords were only half complete, and I was still far from reaching semigod rank. Although I acted like I didn't care, I was actually quite anxious. Semigod rank wouldn't only increase my power level. If I reached semigod rank in the upcoming demon wave, I would be able to use a mega powerful trump card. This would be a foundational change. If I just smoothly created a myth-ranked weapon and forcefully reached semigod rank, not only would there be endless problems, I would also be quite unwilling to accept it. It's not wrong to say that you're always making mistakes in the dark. Death and ice are both the power of chaos. There's an old veteran demon in the Chaos Abyss, the Elven Empress, who's the rightful successor of the Chaos Elven Empire. She's the one who taught elemental magic to the humans. Why don't you ask her instead of me? Indeed, Harlois hadn't even reached adulthood when she died. It was only after she was revived that she began to work hard at learning magic and mastering her own power. Logically speaking, she was no match for her ancestors, but for some reason, ever since I learned of Harlois' true identity, I felt rather awkward when looking at Didina. Besides, since you've already asked that bastard to help you ask Aloyo for something, just relax and wait. I'm quite confident in him. I was quite confident in him as well, but I was even more confident that he would go overboard. He wouldn't be Beifeng if he didn't end up doing something intolerable in the end. Don't even mention it. The sacred lake where the elves were born is still being polluted. I don't even dare to admit that I know him. Otherwise, all the elves will fight me to the death. Lake Ardell was a holy land controlled by the Silver Elves. Legend had it that the Mother Goddess had created the first elves, but now, a certain beast king was causing trouble in the lake, polluting the water and affecting countless divine beasts. This was the foundational reason why Bayfeng was no longer able to stay in the mortal plane. Currently, the Moonwheel Capital's High Priestess Cecilia was having a similar problem. She hated that legendary beast king to the bone. Damned bastard, how am I supposed to explain this to the others? Cecilia was currently riding on a unicorn. Her holy priestess attire was eye-catching. She was also in the prime of her youth, but she had an expression filled with shame. As more and more aura of the chaos abyss leaked out from the dimensional cracks, the Moonwheel Capital's citizens became more and more panicked. But today, they finally received some reassurance. The Silver Elves' reinforcements had arrived. Not only did they bring large numbers of elite Silver Elf Knight and Air Knight, they also brought large numbers of nature divine beasts. These were all the elven gods' favored children. They were truly powerful combat strength. Deer, elephant, bear, and so on. These nature divine beasts usually had the appearance of natural beasts, but they were even more holy and beautiful. They also possessed powerful strength bestowed by the heavens. In the past, only the most devout elves would be allowed to enter the sacred lake to receive divine blessings. Only then would they be able to see these holy and beautiful nature divine beasts. Now that they saw these nature divine beasts in their own city, the elves were naturally overjoyed and their morale was greatly boosted. Everywhere these nature divine beasts passed by, lush green grass would appear like a carpet. No matter what season it was, flowers would naturally bloom. The beautiful nature divine beasts gave off a natural glow. Just seeing them would make people feel reassured. However, Mommy, why are those nature divine beasts' bellies so big? Are they going to give birth to little beasts? I can go see. Before a young elf could finish speaking, his frightened mother covered his mouth. This was a fact that everyone pretended not to see. How could he say it out loud? Asterisk plop. Asterisk a certain high priestess with good hearing fell off her horse, onto a unicorn. Chapter 628. The 8th year of the Dawn Era was destined to be difficult. Astonishing news kept appearing one after another. However, the most popular news right before the demon wave arrived was rather surprising. The wood spirits have begun selling new products, dusk fruits and dawn fruits. Each fruit costs 500 justice points, and each fruit is worth 5 years of life. Each person can only exchange for 5 fruits at most. From a certain standpoint, it was no wonder that this advertisement stole the headlines. When time became a commodity, it would truly be a priceless treasure. There had always been legends about treasures of time like the Spring of Youth, Elven Tears, and so on. I had even seen the real thing before. However, mass-producing treasures of time was something that was rather incomprehensible. The advertisement also explained the restrictions. The dusk fruits could be eaten as many times as one wanted, and it would be fine even if one ate them until the end of one's lifespan. However, the dawn fruits could only be eaten at most 5 times. Otherwise, one's physical body would collapse, and it was highly likely that one would suddenly die. Still, this was more than enough to make all the rulers go crazy. 5 fruits of life that were worth 5 years each meant that one's lifespan would be extended by 25 years. This was at least 1/3 of an ordinary person's lifespan. For a ruler, this was an extension of the peak of their lifespan. It would also be an opportunity for them to receive supreme glory and be evaluated in history, the right to lead a country during the Holy War. With the current exchange rate, 500 justice points was roughly equivalent to the price of killing 5 legend-ranked demons. An adventuring team with an average gold rank would be able to obtain 500 justice points after working hard on several major battlefields for a year. Compared to the lifespan that could be obtained, it actually wasn't that expensive. In fact, it was ridiculously cheap. For a time, the exchange rate between justice points and ordinary gold coins reached an all-time high. 500 justice points would be enough to exchange for a noble title in a small or medium-sized kingdom. Even so, justice points were still priceless. I had just arrived at the meeting place, but when I saw this piece of news, I actually laughed out loud. "You've finally succeeded. What a timely reign." As previously mentioned, the Wood Spirits' Forest of Dreams was a land of dreams that granted them the authority to create. However, the Wood Spirits' creations were limited to fruits and plants, and they could only provide buffs or debuffs to the creatures that consumed them. Previously, the wood spirit's most popular and expensive product was their fruits that permanently increased basic stats. Due to certain reasons, I had long since asked Amelia to research fruits that could change a species' age. Amelia also provided me with the theory of cell division, the relationship between lifespan, hormones, and the pituitary gland, and many other unproven theories. Anyways, in her forest of dreams, thoughts could change reality. As long as these unproven theories were self-justifying, it was possible that they could become research theories. Although it sounded ridiculous, this was indeed the research method of many idealistic mags. They were quite skilled at creating something out of nothing. However, the end product of this fruit definitely wouldn't be the same as the advertisement. I had seen far too many treasures that could forcefully extend one's lifespan, and none of them would cause one's physical body to collapse. However, it was true that no ordinary person with a short lifespan had ever obtained immortality. That was because the aging of one's spirit was far more hopeless than the aging of one's physical body. If one's spirit became too old, their soul and physical body would begin rejecting each other. In the end, their physical body and soul would become separated, and they would either become immobile zombies or living ghosts that could leave their bodies at any moment. In fairy tales, even those emperors that went through so much trouble to find the elixir of immortality had never had good endings. That was why the advertisement of only being able to extend one's lifespan by 25 years wasn't a complete lie. 20 years was a generation. For the first 20 years of one's lifespan, one's values and basic knowledge would be set. Their soul would also be in a stable state. If one continued to progress further, it was likely that all sorts of problems would occur. Actually, forcefully extending one's lifespan by 20 years was something that even great druil, great alchemists, and great priests could do. Quite a few people had done so, but those who went too far suffered retribution. Of course, even the most troublesome problem of extending one's physical body's lifespan could be solved as long as one didn't care about the price. The simplest solution would be to have the kings cultivate martial arts and magic to a certain level, so that their soul and physical body would have a high and stable connection. That would naturally solve the problem. However, when considering that making everyone undying would mean breaking the cycle of reincarnation, even if there wouldn't be any additional problems, it would mean that the balance of resources in the world of Aishi would be broken. Not a single wise person would do such a thing. A dusk fruit that can increase one's age? Your illness can be cured. Harloy's smile was filled with evil intent. She even glanced down at my lower body as she spoke. Damn, what was the meaning of this? Damn, this wasn't developed for me, so I don't care at all. It's true. Hey, why are all of you looking at me like that? I really didn't develop this for myself. Everyone's sympathetic gazes made me furious. This time, I had truly been wrongly accused. Alright, everyone knows that you only developed this for the sake of growing taller. I could only helplessly ask the heavens. I hadn't developed this for the sake of growing taller. The time bracelet was far more useful than any kind of shoes. P2E, I wasn't wearing any shoes to increase my height. I didn't need them at all. Forget it, I'll just tell you directly. This is for the Dawn children. Perhaps it's a bit like pulling up a seedling to help it grow, but it's far more useful than letting the seedling rot in the bone. Many of the Valkyrie reincarnations who were born with knowledge had already displayed their talents and obtained the glorious title of Dawn children. However, a child who was no more than 7 years old would always have a natural shortcoming. Even if the child's knowledge could keep up, the child's courage wouldn't be able to keep up. Even if the child's personality could keep up, the child's appearance wouldn't be able to convince everyone. The Dawn fruit and Dusk fruit that I had developed this time were all prepared for the Dawn children. In my opinion, rather than having the Dawn children powerlessly spend their childhood. Considering the current situation in the mortal plane, it was likely that their childhood would be filled with bloodshed. It would be better to have the Dawn children be able to control their own fates. The Dawn fruit was nothing more than an extra to attract attention. Although items that could extend one's lifespan were precious, they could still be found on the market every few years. However, there had never been any items that could increase one's age. Nobody would want to die early. However, the dawn fruit was a necessity in my original plan. The human dawn children would be able to use the dawn fruit after a few years of hard work. Elves, dwarfs, dragons. Would you expect a young elf child to use a sword dance? Would you expect a young dragon that was no larger than a puppy to cast a forbidden spell? I had previously considered undead magic's curse of aging, but I later discovered that curse of aging used negative energy to forcefully age the physical body. This would permanently damage both the physical body and the soul. Logically speaking, all undead magic would be out of the question. In the future, I would still need to look for the nature faction. I didn't really have many choices in the nature faction, so I finally left this matter to Amelia's 7 virtues. The last time I met her, I even asked her about it, but she didn't have any information. It seemed that she had just recently made a breakthrough in this technology. Roland only found out much later that Amelia had only thought of this because of his reminder, and then successfully developed the dawn fruit. Right, lend me some of your justice points. I'm going to get some fruits. Little Red wasn't the one who spoke to me. She had a delighted expression as if she couldn't wait any longer. I suddenly felt like the heavens were rather unfair. Why was it that every time I plotted something, Little Red would always be the one to benefit? But then, she had a bitter expression. Although justice points couldn't be used to exchange, she could exchange them for items that others could use. Unfortunately, she had just learned that we didn't have any justice points left at all. You've all exchanged books. This was Marguerite. The God's Library had attracted countless mags. That was a true bottomless pit. The ancient secrets of magic had drained even the scholars' wallets dry. I've eaten, drunk, and played. I still have 7 justice points here. Which one of you wants? We ignored Adam's words. Not a single one of us had any hopes for him. This wasn't only because of his personality of casually spending money. The more direct reason was that Marguerite would probably clean out his wallet the moment it was full. Little Red herself didn't know what to say either. She didn't even go out to kill monsters to save up justice points. How could a proud dragon go out to work? Finally, Little Red's gaze landed on me. Considering how often I met enemies and how much I had accumulated in the past, it was highly likely that I still had justice points on me. I proudly raised my head and smiled. I do indeed have more than 2,000 justice points, but I'm going to buy some height shoes. I don't even have enough for myself. I then laughed out loud in delight. Who asked you to laugh at me? Little Red, did you really think that I'd forgotten how you laughed at me back in the day? I hadn't laughed enough yet, so don't even think about returning to normal. The evil dragon bared her teeth and spat out flames from her throat. She seemed to be threatening me, as if she was considering robbing me. However, I fearlessly used my trump card. Besides, one fruit takes 5 years to mature. Dragons take much longer to mature than 200-year-old elves. The stronger a dragon is, the slower they mature. If I did some quick calculations, you probably wouldn't be able to afford it even if I sold you. You'd be better off eating more justice points and growing faster. Alright then, a system notification appeared. Little Red was currently taking a deep breath. Hurry and hide, hurry and hide. Was she going to be spat at for telling the truth in this day and age? Wait a moment, I have an idea. We can rob. That's right, you can definitely rob other dragons. Considering how powerful dragons were, it would definitely be quite easy to earn justice points. However, based on my understanding of red dragons, but, as far as I know, those guys haven't gone out to earn justice points. Even if they need justice points, they'll just wait to rob us. Are you an idiot? You're the Dragon Queen. You're ordering them to earn justice points so that you can rob them. Just as we were planning our grand plan to earn justice points, an unexpected voice spoke up behind us. Actually, I still have some justice points that my demon agent earned in the mortal plane. The person who spoke up was actually Didina. The demon lord Didina actually had justice points from the mortal plane. Even demons are starting to help people level up and buy justice points. Chapter 629. Originally, I had intended to properly record the Elven Empire's revival and enthronement ceremony. After all, no matter how one looked at it, this was a mega event that would be recorded in history. In order to help with the promotion, I even intended to use the 8-legged essay that I was familiar with to properly write about this historical event and analyze its effects on the entire world. In the year FD8, the Elven Empire's founding ceremony, led by Empress Harlois, was held in the small city of Sindel in Danbor. This ceremony symbolized the establishment of the Northland's Elven Empire, and was of great historical significance. The 4 superior elf representatives who participated in this ceremony were the wood elf representatives Kelly and Vonkel, the dark elf representatives Diana, Victoria, and Steel, the moon elf representatives Swana and Marster, and the silver elf representatives Celtis and Cart. The ceremony ended perfectly in a solemn and dignified atmosphere. It took a total of 11 minutes and 17 seconds. Sorry, I couldn't make up any more stories, because I really didn't know how to properly write about a ridiculous ceremony that took 27 minutes to complete, and 70% of the time was spent reciting the elves' tongue-twisting full names. If I absolutely had to record it, I would probably only be able to record the entire process. The Master of Ceremonies announced that the ceremony had begun, and everyone applauded. The Master of Ceremonies began to read out the names of the main participants. Everyone listened very seriously at first, as perhaps these names would all be major figures in the future who would establish the Elven Empire. Then, the Master of Ceremonies used a perfect retroflex voice to repeat the tongue-twisting Elven language in order to use an operatic accent to shout out the glorious nobles' names. Most of the spectators below fell asleep or spaced out. Considering that time was limited, the Master of Ceremonies only read out the names of the main participants. These were the people who had to be registered as the pillars of the Elven Empire, but this still took 23 to 24 minutes. It would have been fine if it had been a meaningful speech, but the entire process was filled with tongue-twisting, meaningless syllables, as well as all sorts of unnecessary ceremonial words. Perhaps even the elves themselves would find it boring. Fine then, I didn't know if the elves would find it boring or not, but Adam, who was sitting in the first row as a witness for the ceremony, instantly fell asleep as the elves beside him glared at him. Then, it was finally time for the main event. Harlois went up on stage, put on a golden crown, and picked up the scepter that symbolized imperial authority. Then, she gave her first speech since taking office. "I swear on my father's name that I will do my best. That's all." Yep, that was all. Then, there was astonishing cheering. "Can we finally eat?" Adam woke up at this time, his saliva dripping all over the ground. The surrounding elves looked at him with disgust. Although everyone was bored listening to him, he was the only one who didn't give them any face and fell asleep. As for me, I'm going to give him a good account here. Tomorrow, I'm going to send him to the Little Fairy newspaper and make him famous. How did he offend you? This guy said that he plans to have 12 kids and form a basketball team. He also said that it's not safe now and that he'll have kids after the Holy War. Back then, it was enough for him to leave the group alone, but he actually flaunted his happiness in front of a single man. How could he tolerate this? I want to make him famous. Let him think that his ugly manners will offend those narrow-minded, pointy ears. Why do I feel like Adam is raising a flag, and it's the most dangerous kind? Why did you turn into a cat again? Only now did I realize that although the gold elf on the stage was beautiful and noble, it was only a clone. The real Harlois had landed on my shoulder. In order to prevent others from sniping and killing me, the average emperor and queen's term is far too short these days. I casually said something that even I didn't believe as the black cat rubbed against my face and licked it. It was cold and ticklish. I feel like I'm more at ease like this. You're so sly. My words caused Harlois to pause in surprise. She looked at me in astonishment as if she had seen something rare, such as an ironwood flower or a meteor shower. You're actually enlightened now? TSK, I've never been an idiot. What do you mean by I swear on my father's name that I'll do a good job? If your father fell into the cycle of reincarnation and never heard from him, you would probably believe it. But in the current situation, isn't it the same as I swear on Dedina's name that I'll do a good job, and look for her if anything happens? Isn't this just sly? The silly cat suddenly chuckled. She laughed quite happily, and then I laughed as well. Damn it, why are you biting me? And then, a cat-eared hat appeared on my head. Although the ceremony was simple, the meaning behind it wasn't simple at all. First of all, when elven emperors and kings inherited the throne, it would be the elven gods' incarnations or high priests who would put on the crown for them. The kings and emperors would have to thank and worship the elven gods, which naturally meant that the royal authority was under the control of the elven gods. But this time, Harlois directly put on the crown. No elven gods were allowed to watch the ceremony. Those who came without an invitation were all sent back. There were also 2 gods' incarnations from the Hades faction as spectators. It probably didn't need to be explained what this symbolized. After a short half-hour coronation ceremony, the audience continued all the way until midnight. Fortunately, all this work could be done on the floating airship. Otherwise, it would have been quite painful to waste so much time. Yes, audience. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to call it dividing the spoils. A new empire would be established. Although it would become a member of the Mist Alliance, it would still need its own territory, organization, and people. In that case, with people, there would be society, and with society, there would be exploitation and classes. I meant the division of labor in society. Perhaps joining the Mist Alliance would be able to break these boundaries. But at this time, it would be best not to provoke the elves too much. Let's first follow the traditional rules. According to the ancient elven tradition of the revived elven empire, the 4 superior elves would support the gold elves' rule. They would also take away the royalty's authority and glory. In that case, the 4 superior elves' positions, authority, and so on would have to be divided accordingly. Although time was limited and it would be impossible to divide everyone's authority, a general framework would be necessary to calm the elves. Everyone else is fighting to the death, yet you're dividing authority and authority. Isn't this dividing spoils? It's clearly under the gold elves' guidance. The 4 superior elves are carrying out their duties based on their natural talents bestowed upon them by the creator goddesses, guiding the elves to a revival. Why does something so honorable become so dirty when you say it? Forget it. Just look at how greedy they are. What's the difference between this and dividing spoils? I'm just always telling the truth. Harlois was rendered speechless. The elves in real life and the elves in fairy tales were similar in appearance. However, there was a huge difference on the inside. These pointy-eared elves were naturally petty and vain. Meanwhile, the superior elves were born above ordinary elves. They were already used to all sorts of conflicts for personal benefits. How could they possibly easily make concessions? For the entire night, we divided spoils, welcomed the elves without stopping. However, what I didn't expect was that none of the temporary leaders of the 4 superior elves were my subordinates. The current leader of the wood elves was the forest elf Fenka Vin Casola. He was a famous great druil among the wood elves, as well as a well-known moderate and coexisting druil. It was only natural that he would be recommended as the leader of the wood elves. He was only slightly more than 400 years old. He was a ruddy-faced, burly wood elf. As a wood elf great druil, he had just reached the prime of his life. However, it was rather strange that he would tremble slightly when he saw me. Your Highness, we met once before. Back then, I had just become a druil, and you left a deep impression on me. The voice of nature is telling me that your soul has become even more powerful than it was back then. We met before. I didn't remember meeting a wood elf great druil before. Hey, did you drop your staff? Why did you run away? Cough, I've heard of him before. He's a survivor of Iceon, and it's said that he has a chronic illness that causes him to shake uncontrollably whenever it snows. You seem to be shaking as well. Harloi's true body was on my shoulder, while her clone was still meeting with the other elves. She was truly capable of multitasking. However, I instantly understood what she meant. Oh, is this a conditioned reflex of eating a popsicle when you were young and breaking your teeth? Whenever you see a popsicle, you'll automatically shiver. I understand now. That's definitely not the same thing. Your family uses Iceon to make popsicles. Damn it, I've been tricked by you. I felt rather uncomfortable as I looked at the great druil who was constantly sneaking glances at me from afar. This wasn't because I was afraid of revenge. It was just that I felt rather disgusted to have a middle-aged man constantly sneaking glances at me, and then suddenly blushing when our eyes met. The temporary wood elf leader was truly a temporary position. That was because there weren't that many wood elves in the Northlands, and this position was mainly to make up the numbers. Naturally, it wouldn't have much authority. However, the other 3 elven species had quite a large number of wood elves. The leader of the dark elves, Steel, didn't have a family name. It was said that she was the younger sister of the holy maiden Lorsai's illegitimate daughter. She was the unlucky bastard who had her body stolen by Harlois. However, she didn't have Lorsai's bloodline. When considering how the dark elves' social circle was so chaotic that it was impossible to tell who was who, and how dark their social circle was so dark that everyone was black inside and out, just from what I knew, I could tell that the inside stories and grudges could be written into several novels. Victoria had always been quite ambitious. Her blasphemy priestess job class had already been played to perfection. The entire Dark Elf society no longer had any gods, but there was a large number of believers. Even Anslo had failed to infiltrate the Dark Elf society. I felt that if I ignored her for another 200 years, it would be only natural for her to suddenly ascend to godhood. And her greatest trump card, apart from my support, was that she had an excellent older sister who was quite powerful but not ambitious. The current Diana was becoming more and more like the number 1 Dark Elf sister. It could be said that Victoria now had the most powerful military and religious authority in Dark Elf society. She was the true uncrowned ruler. However, she was quite sly. She didn't intend to become the tribe leader herself, nor did she allow her older sister, who wasn't skilled at politics, to become the tribe leader. If she really tried to forcefully become the tribe leader, I would be on guard against her. Perhaps she would do something. She also knew that I was wary of her, so she had always maintained a humble and cautious behavior. She also didn't interfere too much with Dark Elf affairs. But what she didn't know was that the more she played around like this, the more I felt that she was incredibly scheming and dangerous. Considering how glorious Victoria's past was in the game's history, if I died and no one was able to suppress her, something would likely happen. A puppet, her. Sorry, I accidentally said the truth. I hurriedly apologized sincerely when I saw that the Dark Elf tribe leader was about to cry. However, the moment I apologized, the little girl really started crying. Although this little girl didn't seem to care about anything, the Dark Elves were actually the strongest of the Northlands elves. They still had their foundational strength, and there were quite a large underground population. Their natural talent for magic resistance would be incredibly useful in the future when the elemental tide became more violent. They had a complete power system to begin with, and they also had powerful job classes like Desecration Priests and Anti-Holy Knight. It was only natural that the Dark Elves would rise. It seems that it's time to suppress the Dark Elves for the sake of balance. I said it out loud. Sorry. Little girl, don't cry. I won't hit you. I'll only suppress you. Alright, I cried even louder. Alright then, I had already scared 2 tribe leaders to tears. I should go off to the side and take a rest. The leader of the Silver Elves was Celtis Rufin Camusi Silverspear. He was an incredibly handsome elf who was a hero on the battlefield among the Silver Elves. He was the core leader of the younger generation, and also one of the main reasons why the Silver Elves had split apart. However, Harlois had an incredibly unfriendly expression when she looked at him. Silver Spear clan. I would never forget that it was the Silver Spear family that had rebelled against the Gold Elves back in the day. Those 2 Silver Spear family elders were still on Harlois' must-kill list. But now that the Silver Elves had just surrendered to the Gold Elves, it was only natural that they would continue using their current leaders. Without sufficient reason, it would be impossible to change the leaders even if I wanted to. TSK, he even has a pair of electrifying eyes, and is even fawning over Harlois, his clone. Harlois, as a bystander and the person involved, how do you feel? Silver Spear. Alright then. Her avatar's smile was like a flower, as if she was amused by the joke. Her true body, Harlois, was still conflicted. If she didn't grit her teeth and hold it in, something bad would probably happen. It seemed that in the future, this upstart of the Silver Spear family would enjoy being bullied by her superior. As for the Moon Elves, they were the most troublesome. Right now, They still hadn't decided who would be the tribe leader. The rulers of the three Northlands Moon Kingdom of the Elves were unable to come to an agreement. And Swana, who was the closest to us, had adamantly refused to become the tribe leader. I'm already an undead, so how can I be too attached to the authority of the living? Since my species has already survived the calamity, I'm already intending to say goodbye to Her Highness. However, the problem was that there were only 3 Northlands Moon Kingdom of the Elves left. Originally, it would have been quite difficult for them to join the Mist Alliance, and the internal situation was incredibly complicated. For the sake of mutual trust, Swana was the only candidate that both sides were willing to accept. If you leave, who are we going to find to be our scapegoat? It won't be easy to find someone who can be bullied on all sides. After pondering for a long while, I said something that attracted everyone's attention. Or, to be more precise, it scared everyone to the point of collapsing on the ground. Swana, do you want to be revived? I can do it. Chapter 630. Swana, do you want to be revived? This sudden question in public wasn't a sudden thought. It was an important part of my entire plan. This wasn't for the sake of the Moon Elves' internal balance. Actually, the Moon Elves were suppressed by the Dark Elves and the Northlands Kingdom of the Elves, so they wouldn't be able to cause much trouble. Rather than the 3 Northlands Kingdom of the Elves who were already scared witless, I was more worried about Victoria and the Dark Elves, who were becoming more and more powerful. Actually, the main reason why I mentioned reviving Harlois was to save myself some trouble. Harlois was revived, right? The fact that she was alive would be able to withstand any divine art or magic. However, I would have to give an explanation for the miracle of reviving the living. Otherwise, I would be in great trouble. This wasn't some imaginary punishment. This was a real conflict of interest. Perhaps some myth-ranked hero would appear in front of me and take my most important subordinate hostage, forcing me to revive some unlucky individual whose bones had already been reduced to dust. As the saying goes, an innocent man gets into trouble because of his wealth. Even for a vicious and evil person like me, once I'm involved in the greatest miracle of this world, I definitely won't be able to escape unscathed. Countless powerful individuals had lost their most important family members when they were young. Even if they knew that time couldn't be reversed, and that resurrection would require a tremendous price, as long as 10% of them were tempted, I would likely be killed over and over again. In that case, rather than waiting for those people to come looking for me, I might as well find an excuse and tell them the conditions and limitations of resurrection. Even if some people still refused to give up, most would believe me, which would save me a lot of trouble. Swana, I can resurrect you because you're a natural undead. I wouldn't be so foolish as to tell the truth. Sacrificing a sufficient amount of soul and power in exchange for the resurrection of an undead sounded quite evil and selfish. Although it didn't seem like a good deal, there would always be people who didn't care about other people's lives. I had seen far too many evil cultists who would shout, "I'm only trying to resurrect my family. Who cares about the lives of those lowly commoners? I'm the righteous one." If I really said that I could casually revive undead souls whose souls had yet to enter the cycle of reincarnation, then there would probably be countless massacres and blood sacrifices in the entire continent in a short period of time. Perhaps I would even receive the title of the man who can destroy the world with a mere movement of his mouth. This was no joking matter. As long as there was a chance to revive one's family or loved ones, powerful individuals who were viewed as neutral or evil would unhesitatingly slaughter entire cities for their souls. As for powerful individuals who appeared to be on the side of justice, how many of them would be able to resist the temptation of making up for their lifelong regrets? This is an accidental product of my research. Natural undead are fundamentally different from ordinary undead. The former are closer to living beings, so as long as I create a custom-made body for them, then use my secret technique to make up for the flaws in their souls, they can be completely resurrected. Everything I said was the truth, but it wasn't the complete truth. While it was true that the natural undead had more potential than the living, it was much easier to revive them. However, that didn't mean that it was impossible for ordinary undead to revive. Those who heard my words would likely be misled by me. They would think that what I meant was that Harlois had been able to revive mainly because she was a natural undead. Natural undead, Those who don't rely on the power of death and are still wandering the mortal plane, there are probably no more than 10 of them in the entire world. Indeed, natural undead are fundamentally different from ordinary undead. They don't have the unstoppable bloodthirstiness of the undead, nor do they need the power of death to control their physical bodies. Their interactions with their physical bodies are quite similar to the living. From a certain standpoint, natural undead are the souls of the living who have lost their physical bodies. Great Druil von Kaur's assistance was truly on point. As an authority on nature and life, his answer was indeed true. His expression as if he suddenly understood something, as well as his usual reputation, made his exclamation seem incredibly convincing and real. Natural undead were the undead who were unwilling to die. They would naturally revive without any external help. Such undead would be incredibly powerful, and they would have far greater growth potential than ordinary living beings. Their birth also represented extreme resentment, most likely the result of some tremendous injustice. Such existences were incredibly rare. The first natural undead in history was Ale, and the most famous natural undead were me, Harlois, and Swana. I was the undying Roland. My undying nature that surpassed the cycle of reincarnation was inconceivable to begin with. Now that I said that natural undead could be revived, it could be said that I had another explanation for my undying nature. Roland Mist was a natural undead, and he himself had the ability to revive natural undead. That was why he was undying. I was probably one of the few existences in the world who simultaneously wielded the power of holy light and the power of death. In the Northlands, I had once used the power of light and darkness to create life, which proved my unique mastery of the soul and life. Not to mention that the other revived person was also the natural undead Harlois. All these facts supported each other, which should be enough to form a convincing chain of evidence. That's right. My method of dealing with this situation was to make the world misunderstand that my method of reviving was limited to natural undead. That way, I would be able to save a lot of trouble. This wasn't a pure lie. It was impossible to revive a soul that had entered the cycle of reincarnation, which meant that it was impossible for me to revive someone who had been dead for a very long time. In that case, if I wanted to revive someone, I would either have to bring their corpse and soul to me in time, or use a vessel to store the deceased soul. This would eliminate 99% of the possibility of reviving someone. Cough, cough, I was getting off topic. At any rate, reviving someone would be far too disruptive to the balance of the world, so it would be better to seal it. I. Everyone turned to look at the banshee Swana. She was so scared that half of her body turned transparent. It was likely that she had never even considered the possibility of reviving herself. Don't be in such a hurry. You can slowly think about it. I don't have the time to hold a revival ritual for you right now. Once the current troubles are over, I'll go to the Northlands to hold a revival ritual. Relax, and don't be afraid. Both Harlois and I succeeded. Reviving a natural undead isn't difficult at all. Everything I said was the truth, as well as misleading. I heaved a sigh of relief as the surrounding elves nodded and exchanged glances with each other. Life and death, reincarnation never ends. Large-scale revivals would definitely break the balance of nature. Perhaps some powerful nature faction individual would jump out and fight me to the death. Occasionally reviving a few would be fine, as the Druil individuals who weren't too extreme probably wouldn't go to the extent of fighting me to the death. But when considering how passionate the nature faction individuals were and how dangerous the extreme nature faction individuals were, I felt that it would be best to stay far away from these streaking enthusiasts in the future. If Druil really dares to make trouble for me, I'll send out my special weapon against Druil, Bayfoam. I wouldn't say this out loud. After all, if I used such a weapon of mass destruction in the mortal plane, I would likely become public enemy number 1 as well. At this moment, Swana reacted, but she shook her head as if she intended to refuse. Thank you, Your Highness, but I'm already dead. The rules of nature. I gagged her and stopped her from saying anything. So you mean that Heloise and I should find a place to dig a hole and bury ourselves? Your Highness, I didn't mean that. I patted Swana's head and rubbed it. Her spiritual body felt quite smooth. Little girl, don't be so stubborn. Learn to accept your elders' good intentions. This is also a type of filial piety. Elder, Swana paused in surprise as she lowered her head. Her soul flashed, revealing that she was unable to calm down. Oh, you don't know yet, do you? Your father was my very first disciple. If that's the case, then you're in the same generation as my grandson, right? What? Not only was Swana shocked, even the other elves had expressions of disbelief. The former elven king of the Tassel Kingdom of the Elves was actually Roland's disciple? What kind of ridiculous story was this? TSK, TSK, TSK. Back in the day, my name was Roland Blackhand. Adrian was my disciple. Are you really unable to find out about this? Back then, he was the one who stabbed me in the back and successfully killed his own teacher. As expected of a new member of our faction. This brat really did a good job. Right, Heloise was the one who taught me magic. She was the one who taught me ice and death magic. I really do have some sort of fate with the elves, hey. I proudly laughed out loud, but all I received was forced laughter. Even the elves probably wouldn't be able to accept the helplessness and shock contained in their laughter. Since it was already revealed, I might as well reveal everything. From a certain standpoint, my fate with the elves was quite deep. The one who taught me magic was the gold elf Heloise, and the magic I learned was used to deal with the elves. I was even tricked by an elven disciple in the process. And I had chosen this path because of the Mist Kingdom's destruction, and the elves had to take the blame for the Mist Kingdom's destruction. I felt like I was in a food chain. The elves betrayed Heloise, and Heloise, who was filled with hatred, taught Emperor Yungnir. Emperor Yungnir caused the scariest calamity in elven history. The god of fate was right. Sometimes, fate's arrangements were ironic and dramatic. Everything was like fate itself. The cause of betrayal resulted in the destruction of the elves. That invisible chain of cause and effect was truly an indescribable coincidence. Right, Adrian killed his own daughter, and I killed him. It would seem that apart from the tradition of killing one's own teacher, our faction also had the tradition of killing one's own children. Don't forget about it. I'm having a headache. Am I really cursed? It would seem that even the silly cat was unable to handle this messy chain of karma. Actually, we all knew that this wasn't some sort of curse at all. This was purely a master-disciple relationship of using each other. It was only natural that they would scheme against each other and finally kill each other. But now that I had revealed my master-disciple relationship with Adrian, I wasn't simply trying to convince Swana to accept my good intentions. After all, I hadn't brought up this master-disciple relationship with Adrian when I started the battle against him. It was more to show the elves that Swana was under my protection, so they should be more careful. Yes, I was obviously worried about the elves. The difference between the short-lived species and the long-lived species was far too obvious. I was truly worried that the elves would cause major trouble if we didn't do anything. Without mentioning anything else, the Mist Alliance was currently implementing a policy of equal opportunity for all species, with equal work and equal treatment. If both elves and short-lived species were to simultaneously work in a certain organization of the Mist Alliance, it would be difficult for the short-lived species to compare to the elves after several decades. All Adrian needed to do was wait for all his competitors to die of old age, and then successfully take over. And after he took over, it was likely that the other elves would take over as well. From a certain standpoint, when abilities were unequal, so-called equal opportunity would only result in unequal results. And if abilities were tied to species, the final result would definitely be that the long-lived and powerful species would take over. Would the short-lived species, which were far more numerous, allow the long-lived species to stand above them? It would only be a matter of time before the long-lived species would take over as well. That was why, although the policy of equal species seemed fair, it wasn't suitable for a magical fantasy world where there were so many differences between individuals. The prerequisite for this policy to be universally applicable was that the long-lived species and abilities were roughly equal. What's the point of thinking so much? If we don't get past the current problem, there won't be any future for us. Harloy's words caused me to stop thinking. I shook my head and stopped thinking about all this nonsense. Indeed, I hadn't even dealt with the current problem yet. Thinking about the Mist Alliance's situation in half a year's time was rather excessive. Once this is over, I'm going to go edit the laws of the Mist Alliance again. At the very least, I need to make the laws more flexible. Is this some sort of death flag? No, it's just the confidence to continue living. We've already gotten past such a difficult situation, so what's there to be afraid of? Chapter 631. 8 years wasn't a long period of time. The Valkyrie soldiers who had joined the Northlands back then were still young kids, but it wasn't exactly a short period of time either. With sufficient benefits and powerful individuals to call upon, the Northlands had completely taken off after several battles. The distance between the new Mist Alliance and the Mega Empires was probably the distance they needed to prove their strength. This wasn't a peaceful Earth. Since everyone knew that a holy war was about to arrive, any increase in national strength would naturally be invested into the bloodshed land. The Northlands Mist Alliance had been making a lot of money from weapons over the past few years. However, their most advanced and mature weapons and equipment were only for their own use. What? Advanced weapons that hadn't even been labeled had appeared on the battlefields in other regions? They hadn't even seen the Mist Alliance's soldiers before? Perhaps I would see those new weapons in the near future, or perhaps I would never see them again. For example, the Super Gnome Death RPGs that had a range even shorter than an explosion radius, or the Super Flamethrower that accidentally purchased unstable gnome fuel, which would explode after 3 seconds of firing. That thing was called a super bomber by some people, and some countries were actually buying it in large quantities. Over the past few years, the Mist Alliance's military observers, weapons dealers, and engineers had traveled all over the world, producing all sorts of weapons and equipment that had been tested in real battles. However, there were some things that the Mist Alliance didn't buy. The new Borealis airship fleet is the most advanced airship fleet in the entire Mist Alliance. Compared to the original Borealis airship fleet, its hull is longer, its armor is thicker, and its cannons are stronger. I know better than all of you. There's no need to explain to me. After I sent away the engineer who kept rambling on, I began to carefully inspect the airship's data. The new Borealis was the first North Star airship. The airship was 302 meters long and 60 meters wide. It had 20 heavy cannons charged with magic crystals, 4 mage towers for defensive spells, and 1 offensive mage tower. The ship's bow had 2 super main cannons with a maximum range of 30 kilometers. It also had a built-in hangar that could store 16 Vulture Type 4 assault airships, 4 Hurricane Type 2 patrol airships, and 40 Pygmy Phoenix fighter airships. Even if this didn't seem like much, the difference was obvious when compared to the original Borealis airship fleet's data. The Borealis was a super-heavy battleship with a length of 243 meters and a width of 40 meters. It had 9 heavy cannons charged with magic crystals, 7 medium mage towers, 1 super mage tower, and 32 medium and small engineering cannons. The super main cannon at the head of the ship had a maximum range of 30 kilometers. It had a built-in hangar that could store 3 Vulture assault ships. Back in the day, the Borealis could be considered a prototype that the Ottoman Empire had meticulously developed. It was indeed very powerful. Not only could it be used as a powerful gunship, it also had a mage tower on top of it to increase the spellcaster's combat strength, and it also had a small storage cabin for small ships. It could be said that it had all the necessary functions. However, in actual combat, it revealed many problems. The super main cannons would be so powerful that even semigod behemoths wouldn't be able to withstand them. However, the mana consumption would be tremendous. A mage tower that lacked mana would easily become nothing more than a decoration. And if the mage tower was attacked by an aerial knight, the mage tower would have to rely on the engineering cannons that had been dismantled from the city walls. Using ground cannons to attack an aerial knight would have a terrible range and accuracy that could be ignored. And if the mage tower was to launch a surprise attack on the ground, they wouldn't dare to casually use their main cannons. They would have to rely on the engineering cannons. These cannons were basically the battleship version of a ground attack plane. They would be far too dangerous and wasteful. As for the Vulture assault ships, it was likely that nobody would count on them. The Borealis prototype could be said to be a classic theoretical prototype. It looked quite beautiful, and its functions were quite comprehensive. However, it was full of problems when used in actual combat. Being all-powerful meant being useless. If it wasn't for the fact that I had transformed it into an undead airship with unlimited endurance, it would have sunk long ago. Meanwhile, the new Borealis was obviously a battleship that was only functional. The Borealis gave up on the overly expensive and impractical large-scale mage towers. Instead, it chose to focus on defensive mage towers. It was likely that the main job of the mags on the ship would be to provide protection for the ship and maintain all sorts of defensive spells. The offensive mage towers would probably only be used when an archmage was stationed on the ship. The Borealis also completely eliminated the engineering cannons that were far too outdated. The Borealis instead doubled the number of magical crystal cannons that could use up magical ores and gems. The Borealis also abandoned the mage towers that used up a large amount of energy. The firepower of the Borealis twin cannons was also doubled. It could be said that the Borealis mid-range and long-range cannons were now many times more powerful. The Borealis would obviously rely on airships for ground and air attacks. The Borealis changed from battleships to motherships, which doubtlessly meant that this was the Borealis' most important combat function. I also learned from some information that the Borealis actually had nearly 100 Griffin Knight and 12 Aurora Knight stationed on the ship. This doubtlessly meant that the Borealis was determined to strengthen its aerial forces. It was likely that even 2 Dragon Knight Knights would be swiftly defeated. The Mist Alliance's engineers were no idiots. Even if I didn't do anything, they learned from actual combat. They unhesitatingly gave up on the old generation's battleship magic squads and cannons. They instead chose to use motherships and airships, which would strengthen the Borealis aerial and ground support abilities. This greatly increased the Borealis' strategic importance to the overall battle situation. All 7 Borealis are motherships. I recalled that the few motherships that were still under construction at the time didn't have any motherships. The Borealis are all motherships that have a certain amount of cannons and cannons. The old motherships have either been sold off or directly modified. The new motherships are all primarily airships. Actual combat has proven the advantages of this combat style. However, due to the limited production capacity of our shipyards, only 4 of the Borealis airships have been deployed. I nodded and didn't even ask for the reason. Shipbuilding required a large amount of money. It also required a sufficient industrial, magical, and alchemical foundation. The Northland's industrial foundation was quite weak. I was already quite satisfied that they were able to accomplish this much. It would seem that I had made quite a lot of money from selling weapons over the past few years. After the Borealis were completed, it would also take time and effort to prepare the assault airships and small fighter airships. None of this could be accomplished in a short period of time. Then, are the other 3 motherships empty? No, this time, Her Highness Renee brought the Avalanche Squadron, Silver Cross Knight Squadron, and more than 10 other infantry and knight squadrons. She also brought the Northland's elves archers and mags. They'll be useful during the landing battle. There are also 16 adult dragons following the airship fleet. However, they're all young dragons that are around 10 meters long. I nodded in satisfaction. At the very least, it sounded quite reliable for the time being. Renee and her airship fleet had already arrived in front of us. It was just that the new Borealis had been sent to pick us up. As for the dragons, as the Mist Alliance and the underground dragon city became more and more connected, the underground's black and red dragons had already become the Mist Alliance's mercenaries. Apart from the fact that these large dragons were paid ridiculously high wages, they were also highly compatible with the motherships. They were fast, highly skilled in aerial combat, and could even cast spells. This made up for the mothership's lack of agility. Of course, the old dragons were still quite reserved. Little Red's underground dragon city wouldn't be able to command them. The dragons and young black and red dragons didn't have any morals to begin with. They used to have the so-called dignity of dragons, but now that the Dragon's Empress had ordered them to do so, they would be able to maintain their dignity and earn money. Humans' wars weren't that difficult for dragons, and their lives would be in even less danger than robbing someone or running into a dragon slayer. Not only that, their income would be stable, and they would also have a good reputation and honor. Why wouldn't they do this? It would seem that Renee isn't here just to save people. If she was only here to save people, then it would be far more convenient to leave all the airships empty. Since she was here with heavy firepower and powerful warriors, it was only natural that she intended to have a good fight. Her Majesty said that this will be the first direct battle of the Holy War. Our Mist Alliance's first airship fleet needs to fight in style and with vigor. And then the fairies will broadcast the entire battle. That'll make it convenient for them to sell their firearms. The young captain of the New Borealis chuckled but didn't respond. However, his silence proved my inference right. You've already mass-produced the shrunken version of the mothership. The first mothership was delivered to Bardi 2 months ago. However, please don't call it the shrunken version. This is Bardi's commercial version. I chuckled and didn't say anything else. The mothership's carrying capacity was limited, and it was here to save people. Renee wouldn't be so foolish as to fill it up with elite troops. She probably only brought a squadron of each troop type with her. She intended to use the battlefield to collect data and test the Mist Alliance's troop type's adaptability against the Chaos Abyss's troops. She's really becoming more and more like it. I could only sigh in amazement. Perhaps Renee wasn't an all-round queen who was skilled at managing government affairs. However, in terms of military affairs, the Night Princess's constant victories brought her endless glory. She had excellent foresight, and she always made correct and far-sighted decisions. As the Mist Alliance continued to grow stronger, Renee became more and more famous. She was faintly becoming the leader of the younger generation. It would seem that I truly chose an excellent successor. One day later, the New Borealis met up with the Big Dipper airship fleet again. I met up with Renee again, but this time, her situation was rather strange. Chapter 632. The elves of the Moonwheel capital were probably feeling rather complex right now. The revival of the Northland's Elven Empire and the return of the Gold Elf Empress was probably a huge blow to their heads. They had wanted to restore the Moonwheel capital's glory and die gloriously in battle in the final moments of the Moonwheel capital, completing the Moonwheel capital's rebirth. But now, they were told that the Moonwheel capital wasn't a proper elven royalty. This was a huge slap to their faces. I'm going to sacrifice myself for the Moonwheel Empire. My sacrifice will be worth it. At the very least, it will be recorded in the elves' history and give courage to future generations. What? I've already been expelled from the Moonwheel Empire? I've even been treated as a traitor. If it weren't for the fact that time was extremely tight, the Moon Elf Empress would have been named the most pitiful person of the year. She would have become a joke for a very long time. Not only that, the Gold Elf Empress Harlois had the 3 god equipment, and she also had the loyalty of 4 superior elf species. This was indeed far more legitimate than the Moon Elf Empress. The Moonwheel capital claimed to have inherited someone else's Moonwheel capital, but the Moonwheel capital's Moonwheel capital hadn't even been completely wiped out yet. It would be a joke no matter how one looked at it. Just like other ancient species, the elves valued tradition and orthodoxy. At this time, even the superior elves who knew the truth were starting to waver, let alone the ordinary elves. Even if the elves managed to survive this calamity, it was likely that their dream of becoming an empire would be shattered. This naturally made the Moon Elves, who were the leaders, feel quite awkward. The reason why the Moon Elves felt such complex emotions instead of pure disgust and fear was because the first thing the Northland's Elven Empire would do after its revival was actually to save their own elves. It was quite obvious that the Moon Elves would accept the Moonwheel capital's assistance, not another country or species. Accepting the Moonwheel capital's assistance would be the equivalent of accepting the Moonwheel capital's authority. But not accepting the Moonwheel capital's assistance. No one would be so foolish as to reject a life-saving straw in such a hostile environment. And so, the Moon Elves fell into a dilemma. However, the demon wave wouldn't give them any time to be conflicted. A tremendous amount of Chaos Abyss's aura permeated the air. The forest that had originally been filled with natural creatures instead became the elves' problem. The wild beasts that were unable to resist the corrosion of the Chaos Abyss's aura turned into chaos beasts. All the villages on the outskirts of the Moonwheel capital were sending out distress signals. The dangerous chaos beasts all desired the taste of flesh and souls. It was impossible to count on the dimensional stability of the Moonwheel capital. There would be reports of demons or demons appearing at any given location. In fact, from the moment that dark clouds covered the sky, it was impossible to see the sun and moon in the sky above the Moonwheel capital. Panic was spreading everywhere. The elves were forced to use the power of nature and the light of arcane magic to maintain the illumination of the Moonwheel capital and calm the people down. However, the extra expenses they had to pay every day made the Archmage and the Great Druil's hearts ache. Although the order to abandon all nearby villages and outposts and return to the Moonwheel city had been given, there were still some elves who hadn't received the order yet. They still hoped that they could try their luck and didn't return in time. When two groups of fleeing villagers were attacked by magical beasts, the Moonwheel capital began sending out rangers and Druil to help evacuate the remaining villagers. Even so, nightmarish news kept arriving at the Moonwheel capital every day. It seemed that this was only the prelude to the demon wave, but the elves were already having a hard time dealing with it. Of course, this was nothing more than a facade. The superior elves were currently using this time to train their elite forces and organize themselves into an army so that they could fight as quickly as possible. However, the ordinary elves didn't know that the news of the demon wave's imminent arrival was half confirmed by the village heads and town mayors. Compared to the previous denial from the Elven Empire, the elves were furious and panicked at being deceived. The true Elven Empress will save us. She's coming with reinforcements from the Northlands. She's forgiven our sins. The elves still have hope. This rumor spread at the fastest possible speed. Even though most elves were still skeptical about this, as the ancient events from 10,000 years ago were far too distant from them, the seeds of this rumor were still planted. As for the Elven Empire's officials, they were naturally quite angry. However, there would always be many rumors during a time of war. Even if they wanted to investigate the source, they wouldn't know where to start. The ones who were spreading the rumors were one of us. Would anyone believe me if I said I wasn't? At the very least, this way, our arrival would attract a lot of attention. Everyone would be waving the gold elf flag everywhere, and the rumors would naturally become true. Even if the moon elves wanted to hide it, they wouldn't necessarily be able to. We were willing to help, but we definitely wouldn't do it for free. We weren't idiots who didn't even have a good reputation. In order to spread the rumors even more, it was likely that all the spies in the Moonwheel capital would be rendered useless. The rumors spread more and more, becoming more and more detailed. In fact, even the fact that the floating airships were about to arrive was revealed beforehand. This was an obvious scheme. But, unless the Moon Elves chose to refuse reinforcements, they could only grit their teeth and bear with it. Meanwhile, I had just finished dealing with the messy matters at hand. I was quite surprised to see Renee, whom I hadn't seen for a long time. I saw Renee on the Mrs. Bridge. However, there were now two strangers by her side. One of them was a tall, blue-haired female knight. She had a pretty face and a slender figure. Even though she was wearing bright red scale armor, she seemed to have a magical aura about her. This feeling was rather familiar, a dragon descendant. The other one was a black-haired middle-aged lady who seemed to be around 15 or 16 years old. She didn't seem to have much power, but if I wasn't mistaken, her family emblem was a lion and tiger with two shields. That was the emblem of the Mosso family, one of the top 3 mega families in the Swallow Federation. If they were only strangers, I wouldn't have paid much attention. But right now, one of them was holding onto Renee's left and right hands, and they were sitting on either side of Renee. If I recalled correctly, that meant, "Greetings, Your Highness Roland. I am Helen Winston, Her Majesty Renee's concubine. You should be quite familiar with my older brother, right?" This tall southern beauty had a healthy, tanned skin tone that was almost sexy. Judging from her aura, she seemed to be quite decisive. However, she seemed rather hesitant right now. "Greetings, Your Highness Roland. I've long since heard of your great name. I am Ivy Mosso, as well as Your Highness's concubine." The moment this black-haired noblewoman spoke, I noticed that she was even younger than I had expected. Under her purposefully thick makeup, she seemed to be only 13 or 14 years old. Both of them looked at me with astonishment and hostility in their eyes. It was a rather complex expression. *Fart. I finally couldn't help it anymore and almost spat on the noblewoman's face. The next instant, I noticed that this was a serious breach of etiquette. I hurriedly did my best to stand still and stifle my laughter. Your Highness Ivy, Your Highness Helen, nice to meet you. I am Roland Mist. And then, I instinctively reached out my hand and asked for a hand kiss. Actually, I was taking this opportunity to lower my head and laugh maniacally. Ha ha ha. Little girl Renee, to think that you would have such a day. How interesting. Even if she didn't explain, it would be far too easy to guess what was going on. Renee was the ruler of a country, and she had long since passed her wedding date. In that case, for the sake of the country's stability, she would have to fulfill the most important duty of a member of the royal family, getting married. Even if she didn't want to marry the main wife, it would still be necessary for her to have a concubine. Something like a political marriage was absolutely necessary. And, her reputation as the Lily Princess had caused other countries to send female noblewomen to marry her. Most likely, this was a compromise after all normal marriages were rejected. The Lily Princess who had no interest in men should have already spread throughout human society. Right now, Renee had 2 concubines. One was the younger sister of the Bardi Empire's Dragon Knight War Emperor Halent, and the other was a noble daughter of the Mosso family of the Swolo Federation. Both were princesses of mega empires, and they were worthy of Renee's status as the most powerful person in the Mist Alliance. This marriage was 100% political, and it represented an alliance between mega empires. Renee was unable to refuse at all. This kind of political marriage that involved the royal family also had unwritten rules. It was quite humane. If both parties got along, it would be fine as long as they were normal husband and wife. If they didn't get along, the emperor would still do whatever he wanted. The concubines would be nothing more than decorations in the palace. Whether or not the concubines would be able to find a lover to relieve their boredom would depend on the emperor's generosity. Since this was a special situation, it wasn't completely unprecedented. There were plenty of emperors who were gay in the past. Concubines of the same gender were only kept secret. Everything else was the same as before. Renee's first wife would definitely have to be male. That was because she would need to have descendants and be recorded in the genealogy, as well as be accepted by the world. She would be forced into a marriage when she didn't have any descendants. That would be quite a joke to watch. I guessed that Renee was intending to invite 2 powerful gods to protect her in order to stop the increasingly dangerous forced marriage. However, I noticed that there seemed to be something off about the way these 2 girls were looking at Renee. They seemed to be the male version of Her Highness Renee. Hey, little girl, where did you touch? Where's the reservedness of a concubine? A man's chest muscles shouldn't be touched so casually. The black-haired girl's eyes were filled with love as if she was looking at her beloved lover. But the next instant, she came to her senses and hurriedly retreated. However, when she saw my face again, her eyes became hazy again, and she reached out with her small hand again. Heroine, please behave yourself. I took a step back and shook off Consort Ivy's hand, who was still in a daze. Then, I glanced at Rain. Her face was filled with helplessness and despair. I couldn't take it anymore and laughed out loud. Ha ha ha, little girl Renee, to think that you would have such a day. How does it feel to be forced into a marriage? The guards around me instantly took a step back and pretended not to hear me. Renee shook her head helplessly and pulled on the red bell next to her. All the guards immediately retreated. Things were different now compared to 8 years ago. Renee was now the true empress. Dignity and such seemed to be quite important to her. Cough, Brother Roland, it's actually like this. The moment Renee explained, the dragon princess viciously glared at me when she mentioned how to address me. It seemed that she viewed me as an enemy, a love rival. But soon, I was attracted by Rain's legendary story. How did she manage to invite 2 powerful true gods to come back and serve them? Then, she mysteriously went through a series of adventures, and the 2 concubines that were supposed to be normal became real, and that was it. The more I spoke, the more bitter Renee's expression became. But in the end, she looked at me with a serious expression. Her eyes were filled with sincere emotions. Actually, we're just pure friendship. Actually, what I truly like is, Perhaps it's only friendship right now, but one day it'll be love. A love that's as hot as lightning and fire. The Blue Dragon Princess's eyes were filled with the flames of love as she interrupted Renée's passionate confession. At this moment, Renée's expression looked as if she had eaten 2 flies. I almost laughed out loud again. Yep, I believe that heterosexual love should be for the sake of future generations. Only homosexual sacrifice is true love. The moment I said this, the 2 concubines looked at me with much friendlier expressions. It would seem that they were also under a lot of pressure. This was truly amusing. If I wasn't so busy, I would probably laugh for the entire day. But right now, I really did have something to discuss with Renée, so I could only shake my head and ask her my question. Queen Rain. Your Majesty Rain, I wonder if the ancestor of your bloodline, that bastard younger brother of mine, has contacted you recently. Chapter 633. From a certain standpoint, Renée had always been raised as a boy who would inherit the throne. After the late emperor passed away, she basically always wore male or knight attire in front of others. Even the words she often used were masculine. Plus, she had the aura of a knight that had been tempered by her long military life. It could be said that if she covered her face, she would probably be even more manly than a man. She had an androgynous face to begin with. She acted manly, had the aura of a valiant military knight, and had great combat achievements that would cause others of her age to fear her. She was viewed as the Princess Charming in the hearts of noble ladies. Prince Charming. For the 2 concubines, they went from hating a political marriage, to understanding each other, to loving each other regardless of gender, and finally to being infatuated with each other. This was enough for many novels. I meant dramas and operas. Actually, considering their statuses, as long as the story was slightly edited, as long as the original story was spread out, there would definitely be novels, operas, dramas, rumors, and so on. People would always be interested in the romantic affairs of the emperors. The more interesting and novel the story was, the more popular it would be. Considering how legendary the Yuri princess was, perhaps many celebrities would be able to make a living off of it. What? I already had a name for this story. Of course, I felt that this story had a lot of potential. I had already decided on the title for my next novel that had a bit of a dirty joke. I would write an adaptation of this true story. Of course, it was quite difficult to satisfy readers' tastes. That was why I was going to expand my harem by 100 times and increase the amount of fighting and killing by 10 times. I was going to bully the second young master every day, flirt with beautiful women, and add a few famous historical figures to the story. People like to read about such things, so it would definitely be a hit. Wait a moment, Renée, why did you draw your sword? Did I accidentally say it out loud again? TSK, it was all a joke, a joke. No matter what, you were my descendant. Would I casually tarnish the Mist family's reputation? Did I seem like someone who didn't know what was important? Really? Stop talking nonsense. Look directly into my pure eyes. How can there be any filth in them? What, everything is filth and evil. TSK, you must have seen wrongly. In order to prevent a scene of my obedient granddaughter furiously chasing after a young grandfather, I brought the topic back to the main topic and directly asked Renée about her demon bloodline. I had previously inspected Renée's physical condition. Although she had obviously come into contact with the power of chaos and became a knight job class that could control the power of chaos, after so many years of blood transfusion, Cavendish's chaos bloodline should have been replaced by my more neutral bloodline. It was said that Rain had even lost a power level due to her bloodline being weakened. That was because if Carwen's had a main god-level bloodline, then according to the rules of the Chaos Abyss bloodline, Rain would be able to borrow power from the Chaos Abyss itself. Of course, Rain would also be restricted because of this. However, my bloodline could only rely on myself. Moreover, the instability of her bloodline seemed to have caused her to suffer from intermittent migraines, and her temper was much more irritable than before. In the long run, this was probably a good thing. After all, having something that completely belonged to you was the most practical. The system's improved version of the people of the Mist bloodline would probably be on par with the Chaos bloodline. At the very least, it would be more suitable for the mortal plane. As her bloodline was purified, Renee's potential would also increase. However, her power level would definitely decrease for a short period of time. Since she was a Chaos Knight, the demons and chaos creatures she summoned would definitely not be as obedient as before. That was because she used to have a powerful existence protecting her. Of course, the arrival of the demon wave meant that the dimensional door to the Chaos Abyss would be opened. Chaos Knight job classes, such as Chaos Knight, Black Knight, Dark Cultists, and Demon Warlocks, would become even more powerful. However, it was no longer necessary for Renee to rely on her personal power level. What was worth mentioning was that Glyna's Chaos Bloodline ritual had been completed even earlier. However, just like Renee, Glyna didn't need to rely on the blood of the Chaos Abyss as she was both a great engineer and a queen. I had originally thought that Cavendish would do something before his bloodline was completely changed. But strangely enough, ever since the world of Hades, he hadn't contacted me at all, no matter if it was direct or indirect. He had even gone so far as to throw away a very important chess piece like Renee. But now, the dimensional door to the Chaos Abyss was about to open, and it was obvious that Cavendish was also involved. What was his goal? Why would he take the risk of being injured and personally injure Anslo in Anslow's divine domain? All for the sake of a single elf? To completely destroy the elves? Was there really such a great grudge between them? I wasn't afraid of an opponent stronger than me. However, I was indeed rather worried about an opponent who I didn't even know my strategic goals. Has Cavendish contacted you recently? Since I had my doubts, I directly asked. Renee and Cavendish had once had a soul connection with each other. If Cavendish really did have any plans, it was highly likely that he would know. Perhaps it was a word, or perhaps it was a thought. Nobody would be able to completely control their own brain. Even a soul connection was possible. This was also why I had completely excluded Renee and Glyna from the Hades plan back in the day. Renee fell into deep thought upon hearing this. After a long while, she seemed to think of something, but then she hesitated. Just say whatever you think. Don't be afraid of saying something wrong. I'm just asking. My ancestor seems to be looking for a certain place that seems very important to him. A certain place? I was rather surprised by this answer. He wasn't looking for the holy war itself. Or was he looking for a certain place? What kind of place would be so important? I shook my head. I didn't intend to dig any deeper. This information wouldn't be very accurate. It was also possible that Renee was intentionally using it as a smokescreen. It could only be used as a reference. If I paid too much attention to it, I would end up being led around by the nose. Two other pairs of beautiful eyes filled with hostility and vigilance caused me to give up on chatting with Renee. I directly ignored Renee's imploring gaze and said goodbye to her. Since I knew that I would be facing a demon wave, no amount of preparations would be excessive. I should hurry up and do some proper business. There should be a shipborne archmage here. Let's go talk to him about the Mage Tower's improvements and preparations. Perhaps he'll be useful. The 7 floating airships formed a squadron. They didn't choose to fly above the clouds. Instead, they chose to fly over densely populated areas. This wasn't just a military operation. It was also a political operation. The attention they attracted along the way made the eyewitnesses feel the urgency and nervousness of an impending winter. Meanwhile, the situation in the Moonwheel capital was becoming ever more tense. The great majority of the elves had already entered the Moonwheel capital's territory. However, the sturdy city walls and magic towers didn't give them much of a sense of security. The dark clouds above their heads were becoming thicker and thicker. Gigantic bolts of lightning were constantly flashing, pressing down on them. As the aura of the Chaos Abyss became thicker and thicker, not only were a few young elves beginning to mutate, even many divine beasts were beginning to feel ill. Of course, it wasn't all bad news. The good news was that the elemental tide was rapidly increasing at a visible rate. The elven archmages' mage towers and mana pools were mysteriously filled to the brim. Their various defensive magic arrays were also becoming significantly more effective. Not only that, the elves' magic power was actually increasing as well. Every day, The elves would hear that some mage or magic knight who had been stuck at a power level for many years would suddenly break through. It was as if the elves' daily progress was equivalent to a year's progress. However, this actually caused the elves' higher-ups to panic even more. That was because the Chaos Abyss creatures, who were accustomed to a high magic environment, had an even greater advantage. Another piece of news that brought both joy and worry was that the elven gods' divine miracles would occasionally appear. The elven gods' priests would be walking around the elves' crowds to comfort them. Reclusive Holy Temple Knight and God's Grace Ranger would be walking out of the forest to join the elves' defense. In fact, even the true gods' incarnations had been witnessed. At the very least, the elven gods are on our side. The reason why this news was said to be both joy and worry was because some people had already noticed the problem. The gods were unknowable. Distance would bring worship, and worship would bring faith. The gods of faith would always carefully maintain a certain distance from their believers. Divine miracles couldn't be performed too often. This wasn't because it would consume too much divine power. Instead, it was because divine miracles would decrease the mysteriousness that would bring faith. The frequent appearance of divine miracles meant that the elven gods cared about the moon elves and valued the demon wave. But it also meant that even the elven gods had been forced into a corner. Actually, it would be easy to understand the elven gods' current predicament if one analyzed the situation. They were probably even more anxious than the mortals. The current elven gods were the third generation of elven gods. Most of them were gods of faith. More than 80% of their believers were elves. Their greatest source of faith was the Moonwheel capital and the elven species. If the Moonwheel capital was destroyed in the demon wave, it was likely that a large number of elven gods would either lose power levels or fall into eternal hibernation. Meanwhile, the Northland's elven empire had already clearly announced that the gods of the Hades were supporting them. The rise of an empire would often be closely related to the rise of a god or a god faction. It wasn't important whether or not the Hades gods needed the elves' faith. The important part was that the elven gods really needed the elves' faith. The elven gods didn't have faith or believers. They didn't even have a main god-level god who could support their god faction. As long as the new elven empire was destroyed, the elven gods would truly be finished. Not only that, these things couldn't be told to mortal believers. The gods' frequent interference can only mean that they don't have any confidence in the upcoming demon wave at all. It was likely that the gods would definitely interfere with the demon wave this time. And as the Holy War officially began, the elemental tide would increase exponentially, and the Chaos Abyss would be directly connected. The gods wouldn't only send their incarnations. Gods would meet each other bare-chested. This was rather comical and pitiful. Since when had the elven gods, who once ruled over the entire world, fallen to the point where they had to personally participate in the first demon wave? Not only that, it was highly likely that they would lose. Misfortune would always come in pairs. What one feared would happen. When the final dimensional crack was destroyed, the demon army would arrive. Perhaps the elven god faction's Twilight of the Gods would soon arrive. Chapter 634. At 2:04 a.m. on December 7th, Foot 8, the holy war that had been brewing for so long finally erupted. The pitch-black clouds that covered the Moonwheel capital for the past 4 days suddenly dispersed. However, what the elves saw was no longer the bright moonlight and night sky of the past. Blood-red moonlight was shining down upon the land. Fierce winds brought with them the stench of sulfur and rotting flesh. In the sky, the elves could faintly hear the laughter of demons. Not far away, it was as if stars were falling from the sky. Starlight gathered in several gathering spots. This was a protective star net created by the god of fate and the moon goddess. Every invader that entered the mortal plane without permission would be marked by this net. This was a super forbidden spell that caused two powerful gods to instantly become mid-divine powers. Not only could it mark dimensional invaders, the brightness and scattering of the starlight would also indicate the enemy's strength and number. Scales that could detect dimensional invaders weren't any expensive or rare item. The contract heroes used small compasses to hunt for their prey. Large cities used compasses to guard against evil cultists and dimensional invaders. But in the main hall of the Moonwheel capital, There were far too many blinking red dots that compasses became meaningless. Tens of millions. When the densely packed red dots finally connected and covered the entire map, all the counting had lost its meaning. The highly polluted power of chaos caused everyone's vision to naturally be covered in a layer of red light. Fighting under this blood-red moonlight would greatly increase the chances of losing reason and going berserk. At the end of everyone's vision, numerous bonfires and fireballs lit up the night sky. The fire elves that had lost all sense of reason were wantonly releasing their heat. Every forest they passed through became a field of fire. And right now, even the most loving druid didn't dare to criticize the fire elves for destroying nature. Starlight Fall. The first wave of defensive magic was activated, causing the sky to open up again. Countless meteors rained down, accompanied by endless screams and furious roars. But in the next instant, everything returned to normal. The only difference was that the blood-red eyes kept flashing in the dark night, as if they were laughing at the elves' powerlessness. When the forbidden spell's light faded, two bright stars appeared in the sky before the elves, flashing with a murderous red light. And when the meteor's fiery light faded, even the bravest ranger was so frightened that he dropped his bow. Those weren't stars, they were just a pair of eyeballs of the black giant. The black giant was as huge as a mountain. He slowly moved forward. Although he was still dozens of kilometers away, the black giant's figure could be seen in every corner of the city wall. Every step he took caused the earth to tremble in fear. A black wind that carried the stench of the abyss drove away the dark clouds, and the blood-red moonlight illuminated the pitch-black plains. Behind him, countless monsters from nightmares crawled out. Some of them were legends, some were unimaginable, and all of them had turned into reality. There was a centipede giant with hundreds of feet and hundreds of heads, an inferno demon that stomped on a path of sulfur, a giant white wolf that brought hurricanes with its breath, a disgusting piece of filthy meat, and a horde of inferno dragons that breathed thunder flames. Not a single one of these behemoths was the same, but it was obvious that they were all at the top of the food chain. The valiant elf game sucked in a breath of cold air. The hunter who had once hunted down a giant dragon was also trembling. An army of this scale had already surpassed the scope of mortals' understanding. This was an opponent of the gods. The tall black giant lifted his head, glanced at the blood moon that was like a watcher, and finally pulled out his obsidian greatsword, pointing to the distance. Kill them all. The sound of thunder reverberated throughout the entire space. Even though it was clearly just a simple explanation, it was as if it was narrating the truth of the world. Even the elves who were being pointed at by the sword instantly lost the will to resist. The black ocean around him finally began to move. They were like countless tiny insects, but the ranger's eagle eyes gave him a despairing conclusion. Each of these tiny insects was a giant demon that was more than 3 meters tall. These demons and magical beasts had been following their master all this time. It was just that the black giant and his army were far too powerful, causing everyone to ignore the equally dangerous existences that were watching him. Even if these demons were only cannon fodder, they would still be cannon fodder in a battle between gods. They would still be fatal to mortals. A gigantic demon battle beast walked out from the demon army. However, its body was covered in black ants. Even the shortest of these ants was more than 10 meters tall. These demons didn't need any siege equipment. All they needed to do was to touch the city walls and toss the demons onto them. The Chaos Demon Lord seemed to dislike the ants for blocking its path. The berserk Chaos Demon Lord grabbed the ants, stuffed them into its mouth with one hand, and tossed them away with the other. The demons struggled powerlessly in midair. Most of them were smashed into meat paste before they even reached the city walls. However, a few managed to pass over the city walls, causing quite a bit of chaos. A gigantic inferno demon lord took advantage of this opportunity to transform into a meteor and land on the city walls. However, a few demons managed to pass over the city walls, causing quite a bit of chaos. Warriors. Even Donates, the Chaos War god, will never be able to destroy our final home. Under the blood moon, a beautiful figure wearing a white silk robe on a tall tower on the city walls attracted quite a bit of attention. The silver bow in her hand was surrounded by the moonlight, and mana waves were like tidal waves. It was evident that this was an incredibly powerful god equipment. Your Highness Athena. When the warriors recognized that this was their Empress Athena, their morale increased even more. At the same time, numerous mage towers lit up as fireballs and flame explosions shot towards the beast wave. Every single attack was at least at the level of a 9-circle spell. The moment that the demon wave began, the Ashi plane had also entered an era of high magic. Magic spells of the same level would now be at least twice as powerful as magic spells of the past. Since both sides were still quite far away, the elven archers didn't intend to waste their arrows. However, the elven archmages used the buff from the mage towers to choose the simplest and most practical battlefield fire magic. Numerous fireballs ignited the beast wave. However, the distant Chaos War god didn't move at all. His statue-like expression didn't change at all. It was as if the enemy before him wasn't even able to attract his attention. However, as far as he could see, the black beast wave around him was moving even faster. Before the first beast wave reached the Moonwheel capital's city walls, countless treants stood up outside the Moonwheel capital's city walls. They blew their ancient horns, causing the entire forest to come to life. All the trees transformed into treants and joined the ranks of the Moonwheel capital's defenders. The rangers jumped onto the Trent's branches. Some even brought their ballistas with them. Everyone knew that they were nothing more than ants in a battle against the behemoths. However, they would use their lives to make up for the Trent's slow speed and lack of long-range attacks. Both sides got closer, closer, and closer. When the black sea of arrows collided with the green moving city walls, all the elves forgot to breathe. Countless arrows descended from the treetops in beautiful arcs. Every arrow perfectly pierced through a demon's head. Before the elven rangers could even be proud of their excellent archery skills, the demons that had their heads pierced through didn't die. These demons fervently searched for their enemies and attacked. No matter if they met an enemy or not, they unhesitatingly used the most powerful explosion even if they touched the city walls. 1,000-year-old treant collapsed first. This treant didn't die to a demon's attack. Instead, it was killed by a dense horde of demon war slaves. This treant was no longer able to maintain its balance. The ranger standing on top of this treant was torn to shreds before it even collapsed. At its feet, berserk demon war slaves self-destructed one after another. These ancient treants were famed for their thick skin and flesh, but they were instantly reduced to dust the moment they knelt. These ancient treants were trash among demon war slaves. They were cannon fodder among cannon fodder. Their merciless commander had ordered them to unhesitatingly sacrifice their own lives. In Donotti's eyes, commanding such foolish and weak creatures was something shameful to begin with. He unhesitatingly ordered the treants to do their best to destroy their enemies before they died in battle. 5 minutes. In a short 5 minutes, the demon war slaves sacrificed everything in order to self-destruct. Large batches of 100-year and 1,000-year-old treants collapsed. These ancient treants were the elves' final line of defense, but they were as weak as paper. Finally, the moon elves blew their horns. Silver-armored knights riding silver unicorns and other god beasts charged out. Meanwhile, their allies, the treants, began retreating back into the city walls. Originally, the elves had intended to use the powerful treants to stop the demon wave's attack and increase their own side's morale at all costs. However, they were now using elite treants in exchange for the enemy's cannon fodder. Naturally, they were at a major disadvantage. In a short 5 minutes, more than 30% of the treants had died. Almost 500 treants had collapsed on their way back to the city walls, never to rise again. More than 1,000 elven rangers had died along with them. Even humans wouldn't be able to afford such a sacrifice, not to mention the elves, who were individually strong but had fewer members. In this instant, the demons used their actions to tell the elves what an eternal holy war truly was, and what an unstoppable demon wave truly was. Will we be able to win? If this was Donottis's initial display of strength, then he had already succeeded. Now, even the most optimistic elves were beginning to doubt if they could survive. Chapter 635. When the stability of space was broken and countless nightmarish monsters flooded in, countless powerful individuals who were in hibernation or living in seclusion all looked up at the southwestern sky of the continent. In that direction, not only were there countless stars guiding the enemies of the mortal plane, it was also the source of the revolution. Even if the powerful individuals closed their eyes, they would still be able to tell where the battle was going. The elemental waves were no longer just elemental tides. They were waves each higher than the last. The visitors from another world had broken through Aesha's wall of order, and endless elemental energy poured into this world. The era of high magic had truly arrived. Ancient dragons in hibernation were coming out of their caves. Ancient species that lived in seclusion deep in the mountains and forests were coming out of their forests. The powerful creatures that could only live in high magic worlds were finally welcoming their own era. In the chaotic sky, the airship fleet of 7 airships met with trouble. It wasn't that they had malfunctioned. It was that the mana tide had suddenly increased, causing their engines of the same power to produce several times more power. The airships instantly shot up into the clouds. Fortunately, we had already prepared for the sudden increase in the elemental tide. Those at the helm were all experienced pilots, and they followed the plan and promptly shut down the secondary engines, adjusting the airship's balance, and stabilizing the airship's center of gravity. The mage towers also activated anti-gravity magic in time. That was the only way the hilarious situation of the entire airship being annihilated before even encountering any enemies occurred. But while we were prepared, the same couldn't be said for other areas. Not only would the mechanical airships be in danger, even the magical beasts that relied on magic to fly, including the dragons, would all lose their balance and fall down in circles. This was just like back on Earth. If an airship was flying in midair, and the constant of gravity and the engine's output suddenly changed, there would be very few people who wouldn't fall down if they weren't prepared beforehand. If Aesha also had an insurance company, just today's compensation alone would be enough to bankrupt them. TSK, 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 what a grand sight. Our airship was fine, and our accompanying black and red dragons also fell down as expected. But judging from their pitiful screams, I guessed that they wouldn't die. You must have done this on purpose. Why didn't you tell them? No, I did it on purpose. Of course I was doing this on purpose. The black dragons and red dragons that I had hired were all incredibly arrogant. When I requested that they stay in my airship for the time being, they even dared to mock me for not having wings and not knowing how to fight in the air. They said that they would not feel safe inside this iron fortress and that they would all be dead if they were ambushed. Now, I wanted to see how they would fly even if they had wings. An old dragon with plenty of combat experience would naturally be able to adjust the balance. However, an old dragon who knew my name and temperament wouldn't ignore my words. These little fellows who were less than 100 or 200 years old. Hihi, bungee jumping without any ropes must feel really good. Even if they didn't fly very high, other flying magical beasts should have died directly after falling from a high altitude. However, dragons could use magic to strengthen their bodies. When they were close to the ground, they could still use magic. Generally, they wouldn't die, but they would inevitably fall unconscious. Now that all the flying dragons had fallen from the sky, our airship fleet naturally needed to reorganize itself. However, they weren't the only ones that needed to be reorganized. The difference between a high magic environment and a low magic environment was just like the difference between ancient Earth and modern Earth. The difference in oxygen would cause the ruling species to be vastly different in size. The most direct example would be the difference between the physical bodies of dinosaurs, whales, and modern humans. Since these ancient beasts had insufficient oxygen in this world, their overly powerful physical bodies were unable to adapt to such a poor environment. In the end, they all left the stage of history. But now, the oxygen-mana ratio had returned to ancient times. They had returned. A fierce melee battle between dinosaurs and humans was about to begin. When considering the most dangerous levels of the Chaos Abyss, the natives that even I felt were incredibly dangerous, perhaps the difference between the natives of the Chaos Abyss and the natives of the mortal plane was even greater than the difference between the dinosaurs and humans. This wasn't an exaggeration. For a long time, only the strongest legends in the mortal plane would dare to team up and explore the Chaos Abyss. Even the ordinary natives of the Chaos Abyss would be a huge headache for them. As for the top-level combat strength of the Chaos Abyss, not to mention the main gods, even the demon lords would be incredibly difficult to deal with. The most foundational difference was the difference in basic combat strength. 80% of the Mortal Plains natives were ordinary people who were busy with their daily lives. Rather than worrying about whether or not they would suddenly be eaten by demons, they were more worried about the price of food on the market, the increase in luxury goods, and so on. Fighting and so on were all warriors' responsibilities. However, such a method of survival was far too naive compared to the lower planes. There were no non-warriors in the Chaos Abyss. Every existence would have to fight for their own survival. Every mouthful of food and water would be fought for with their lives. Not to mention, only through killing and devouring could one evolve and obtain the power to survive. Placing the Mortal Plains natives and the Chaos Abyss's natives in the same world would be the equivalent of placing a carnivorous Tyrannosaurus and an unarmed ordinary person in the same cage. It was obvious what would happen. But now, the restrictions on oxygen and magic had been completely lifted. The ancient beasts hidden in the Chaos Abyss had returned to the mortal plane. And this time, even the mastermind who had been limiting the scale of this battle had disappeared. Perhaps this unbalanced battle between dinosaurs and humans would end in the most pitiful manner, with one side being completely annihilated. However, there was always a way out. Hurry up and drag all the big guys out of those warehouses. The airship was anchored in a grassy plain. The gnome engineers swiftly got to work, dragging out all sorts of equipment and weapons. This was the next generation of the magical-powered heavy cannons, the second version of the magical-powered heavy cannons. Not only was it capable of using mana and magical ores to fire heavy cannons, it was also capable of absorbing elemental mana from the air to increase the cannon's power. The longer it was prepared, the more powerful it would be. However, in a low-magic environment, its power was far inferior to the first version. But now, in a high-magic environment, when the cannon's power reached the upper limit, the cannon's power would be more than 3 times greater than before. It would be no laughing matter for one cannon shot to shatter a city wall. Crystal wall armor was a defensive combination of many small and medium-sized magical shields. It was several times sturdier than current alloys, yet only half as heavy. However, it doubtlessly consumed a large amount of energy. But now, in front of a new piece of equipment, energy consumption was no longer a problem. Core Magical Engine Type 3, High Magic version. Magical Anti-Gravity Engine Type 3, High Magic version. These were the same models as the previous ones. However, from the annotations behind the names, it could be seen that this was an engine that had been specially prepared for the Holy War's high magic era. This engine was much more powerful and consumed much more energy. K3 rocket firing system, gnome sniper helicopters, all sorts of theoretical experimental weapons prepared for the Holy War were pulled out of storage. They had been waiting for this day for far too long. In the game's history, when the Holy War of Despair descended, magical engineering began a new era of great development. When the Chaos faction sent out endless nightmares, the high magic era ushered in a new era of high magic warfare. All of this originated from Olivia's magic box from 10 years ago. Olivia's magic box's appearance allowed the flamboyant but impractical gnome engineering, and alchemy to be combined together, giving birth to the brand new magical engineering school. Magical swordsmen and magical knight wielding magical mechanical weapons and equipment gradually replaced pure warriors and knight warriors. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the choice of the generation. In a high magic era, the power of magic would multiply, which would greatly weaken melee job classes and pure rangers' combat strength. Warriors who were still active on the battlefield would definitely choose to change and use magical engineering to grasp a certain amount of elemental power. Due to my interference, Olivia's magic box's appearance was brought forward by several decades. Magical engineering, which had originally only begun to greatly develop in the middle of the Holy War, was now flourishing everywhere. In that case, the appearance of these magical weapons and equipment, as well as the rise of magical sword job classes like the 4 elemental swordcasters, had also been brought forward by several decades. In fact, it was even ahead of the generation itself. The seeds that I had planted back then had finally sprouted. And so, the moment that the Elemental Sea arrived at the beginning of the Holy War, the Mist Alliance's well-prepared armed fleets began to completely upgrade their equipment. While the new blueprints and weapons brought greater power, they naturally also came with many hidden dangers. However, we didn't have time to wait. We could only test the effectiveness of these new equipment through battle. Even if this fleet is completely destroyed, it'll be worth it as long as we can bring back the battlefield data. From a certain standpoint, the Holy War was indeed a game between the Goddess of Order and the Goddess of Chaos. While the Chaos Abyss achieved extreme evolution through the survival of the fittest and the survival of the fittest, the Order faction was also evolving. The Order faction was evolving their entire society, their entire civilization. Perhaps the Order faction's individual power would be weaker than the powerful individuals of ancient times, but every technological advancement and innovation would mean the advancement of the entire civilization. And this advancement of civilization would also mean actual power. This wasn't just something that humans could do. The great demon empires witchcraft, the Halitdam generation's alchemy and soul studies, the dwarf smelting of stones and metals, and the Undead Republic's research on the nature of death and undead magic. It was only in this generation that the intersection of magic and engineering caused magical engineering to become the new favorite of the new generation. I could only sigh as I watched the busy scene before me. I was both happy and sad. I was happy because not only had we managed to keep up with the new generation, we had even become the new generation's leading sheep. But I was sad because my great faith battle had mysteriously taken a hit again, and it was highly likely that I would be crippled. What I meant was that swordsmanship cultivation would probably decline. Even a sword saint who worked hard for several decades might not be able to match up to a newbie magic swordsman who could control a magic sword. How many people would still be willing to work so hard to improve their swordsmanship? In the future, I'll probably have to start learning meditation and magic sword control after learning basic swordsmanship. By the way, mags who had mastered the secrets of magic were naturally the new favorite of the new generation. Their magic power, mana consumption, and mana regeneration abilities would all greatly increase. It would also be incredibly easy for them to advance in power level and research new spells. Not to mention the summoners, necromancers, and demon warlocks who had connections to other dimensions. It would be far easier for mags to borrow power from powerful existences from other dimensions. Their magic power would also be greatly increased. With this twofold buff, mags would become ridiculously strong. They would be able to summon a group of cannon fodder at any time. They could casually cast meteors, blizzards, and thunderstorms. It would be far too easy for them to bully melee job classes. Pure warriors would finally be able to compete with summoned pets for the position of cannon fodder. Alright, as expected of the mags' sons. Warriors are poor losers, and mags are quite strong. Let's just kill sword girls. I digressed from the topic. Every generation, there would be a mage. As for those who went against the trend, there would be idiots who went against the trend. There was probably no need to mention what would happen to them. Since a high magic generation had arrived, we would have to adapt. Besides, the Mist Alliance was definitely ahead of the rest of the world in this area with the help of the strategy guides and the combat experience in the high magic dragon world. It was good to have beta testing experience. When I returned to my senses, I saw that the engineers were still busy working. Little Red was scolding the young dragons who had been pretending to be powerful but ended up falling all over themselves. The mags and warriors were also doing their best to adapt to the new environment. Harlois was also overjoyed. As a pure mage, what could make her happier than a high magic generation? Especially since this high magic generation was different from the previous ones. There was no limit to the elemental elements. This was the strongest high magic generation in all of history. I hereby announce that the elves' magical generation is about to arrive. Harlois still had a worried expression on her face as if she was worried about the elves in the Moonwheel capital. However, she was already grinning from ear to ear. Her words actually made some sense. All human magic had been taught to them by the elves. There were quite a few top-level mags and elves. Plus, there were all sorts of mystical inheritances. It seemed that this was indeed the most suitable generation for magic. After experiencing so many holy wars between high magic and middle magic, the elf storerooms should have many inherited magic spells. As long as they were properly excavated, It would seem that there was hope for the entire species to prosper. However, I knew that this was impossible. You're wrong. In the game's history, the elves didn't last long before they were finished. They didn't even come into contact with many magical engineering products. What? Why's that? Magical engineering is a combination of machinery and magic. What do you think the elves' attitudes towards machinery are? How many dwarfs and gnome engineers would be able to stand the elves' faces? Besides, magical engineering greatly reduces the difference in combat strength between individuals. Do you really think that this is a good thing for the elves, who have fewer people and more skilled soldiers? Harlois fell into deep thought. The current her really did seem like an empress. After a while, she raised her head again with a resolute expression on her beautiful face. It seemed that she had come to a decision. This time, it won't be the same. At the very least, the elves under my command won't reject the change of this generation. Yep, of course. The game's history has long since changed. The future is in our hands. Chapter 636. Even though we were on the way, and even though our weapons and equipment were being upgraded, we didn't have time to rest. Battle reports from the front lines were constantly sent to us like snowflakes. The diplomatic front lines were the same. Intelligence gathering was still ongoing. The Northland's Mist Alliance's diplomats were doing their best to negotiate with the various countries in order to obtain permission to safely retreat. Compared to regular sources of information, the fairies that appeared and disappeared unafraid of death were everywhere. They were the best source of information. Not only that, ding, your VIP account has been recharged. These damned goblins from the universe are still charging money at such a time. That's not bad. They're already giving you a 20% discount. It's already quite good to have new information sources at such a time. At the very least, it means that they're on our side. The fairies' salesman had come to us of his own accord. Of course, we wouldn't refuse. In any war, information was of utmost importance. And, the fairies' current actions indicated that they had a side. Gathering information from the front lines was dangerous and inefficient. Moreover, it was necessary to ensure that information was quickly transmitted. Based on how the fairies calculated their wages, the cost of information would naturally be high. Even with a 20% discount, it would still be ridiculously expensive. But that was fine for me, because I could get the Mist Alliance to reimburse me. The battle reports recorded the scale of the dimensional cracks, which were directly labeled as semi-permanent. This meant that it was impossible to stop the Chaos Abyss's invasion. Both sides had already started fighting. The elves were probably still probing each other. The elves had suffered some losses, but it was still within acceptable limits. The battle had already reached the outer city walls. However, most major cities would have multiple layers of city walls. Judging from the information, the Moonwheel capital was a mega-city with 5 layers of city walls. In that case, it could only be said that the battle hadn't truly begun yet. As expected, the demon wave from the Chaos Abyss was already spreading everywhere. Although the Moonwheel capital was like a nail that blocked the demon wave, a nail would never be able to stop the demon wave. Countless demons and Chaos Abyss magical creatures ignored the barrier and began spreading throughout the entire Elven Kingdom. They were wild beasts from the Chaos Abyss. Without the control of their master, they would become mindless destroyers. They would destroy everything before them like locusts. Ancient forests would be corrupted into demonic forests. Mountain ranges would be flattened. The great majority of living creatures would be immediately eaten or killed. Those that survived would also evolve into a part of the Chaos Abyss. The daimons and demons of the Great Mana Tide did not fear sacrifice. They even desired death. When they died on this land, their corpses would fuse with the earth, and the entire region would be polluted by chaos and the abyss. The aura of the Chaos Abyss was infecting both the sky and the earth. The death of the Chaos Abyss's creatures directly began to infect the natural cycle at a deeper level. Soon, this place would truly become the land of the Chaos Abyss, the frontlines of the entire Chaos faction. The corpses of living creatures were an important part of the natural cycle, but under the control of the power of the Abyss, The speed of this cycle was more than 100 times faster than normal. In this land of the dark abyss, the wild beasts would naturally transform into magical beasts, the residents would naturally demonize, and even the crops in the farmers' fields would become man-eating plants. After the new food chain and natural cycle was solidified, ordinary people wouldn't be able to survive. Full Moon Elf Empire? They were destined to become history. Even if they managed to survive this war, this territory would no longer belong to them. From a certain standpoint, territory was equivalent to population, as well as a species' future potential. And for the gods, population was also equivalent to the number of potential believers. If their territory was greatly reduced, their population would also decrease. That was to say, if they lost their territory, that would be the equivalent of announcing the death of the god that the elves worshipped. There was no doubt that the fairies' information was accurate and timely. I even suspected that the fairies weren't creatures from the dimensional wall. As time passed, the elf situation kept worsening. Currently, it was confirmed that the Chaos faction was indeed led by Donates. However, he didn't seem to have any intentions of personally participating. He simply allowed the Chaos Abyss war slaves to freely attack the elves. The elves were showing signs of collapsing. The Treants suffered heavy losses. Although ancient war trees and 100-year-old Treants could regenerate, the rate at which they regenerated was no different from a non-renewable resource. It was likely that the elves wouldn't be able to regenerate even after the Holy War was over. It could be said that the elves had taken a major loss right from the start. In order to prevent the situation from worsening any further, the elite Silver Elf Knight Squad charged twice. This was the biggest highlight of the battle report. Even back in the ancient Elven Empire's era, professional Silver Elf Knight soldiers were considered top-level combat strength. Their steeds would be high-level magical beasts at the very least. Rare beasts like unicorns could be easily found. Plus, the Silver Elf Knight had secret techniques for controlling their steeds, as well as the Silver Elf Knight's personal strength. Even the Beastman's behemoth army would be forced to retreat in a group charge. I had once witnessed a small team of Silver Elf Knight knights in a suicidal charge. The Silver Knight in the team kept casting all sorts of divine arts, ranging from morale buffs to strength buffs. They could also use the Silver Elf racial talents to buff the power of their weapons and equipment. Their unicorn steeds would also buff all sorts of magic, especially speed buffs and healing spells. By the time they reached the front lines, more than 10 different types of buff magic would stack on top of each other. The power of their charge would be increased by at least 10 times. Also, their racial talents could buff their armor with defense and increase the sharpness of their weapons and equipment. Under the faint silver light, their lances would become incredibly sturdy and sharp, making them incredibly powerful. If this Silver Elf Knight Squad was evaluated based on pre-battle standards, it would be expected that if they were given enough time and distance to charge, they would have an average legend rank combat strength. In historical records, there were records of Silver Elf Knight Squads directly breaking through city walls. Considering the small team I had encountered in the past, such records were probably real. However, the stronger the unit, the more expensive it would be. Equipment would be more difficult to obtain, mounts would be more difficult to raise, and knight training would be more difficult. The Silver Elf Knight Squad I had encountered in the past was already the entire royal guard of that unlucky prince of the Kingdom of the Elves. Silver elves were just as rare as other superior elves. It could be said that every single silver elf was a member of the nobility. Not to mention, now that we were in a new generation, it became even more difficult to raise mounts like unicorns. It just so happened that only an organized group of knight squads would be effective. Most countries believed that the Silver Elf Knight Squads had already become history. They never expected that the elves would still have such a trump card. A Silver Elf Knight Squad consisting of around 2,600 Silver Elf Knights. This truly is a trump card. Perhaps even a prince or tribe leader is personally participating. That's strange. Why is it that my intelligence reports say that many mounts go to the battlefield with big bellies? The elves are far too cruel to actually abuse their mounts like this. As a veteran knight, I expressed my strong indignation at the elves' behavior of abusing their mounts. I would also take care of the possibility of further complaints. What? Many of their mounts were divine beasts from the Holy Lake. Was this a rumor about a recent crime? I should just pretend that I didn't see anything. I furrowed my eyebrows as I read the battle report. Since the elves had sent out cannon fodder, the elves would have to send out their trump card. It was obvious who was at a disadvantage. Cavalry charges had always been synonymous with high casualty rates. Although the elves' 2 charges had great results, they had also lost more than 200 Silver Elf Knights. Most of the Silver Elf Knights had been dragged off their horses by the cannon fodder at all costs. Those who fell off their horses during the charge were basically dead. The elves' charge was successful. The Treants entered the outer city walls, which boosted the elven army's morale. The Silver Elves unhesitatingly retreated. It would seem that they couldn't handle such losses. The battle afterwards entered a stalemate. Even with the demon wave, it would take more than a single day to take down the elven capital. Denotes didn't need to be in a rush. More and more reinforcements would arrive from the chaos abyss. Time was on their side. The demon wave continued spreading. A portion of the demon wave surrounded the elven capital under Denotes' command. Meanwhile, the cannon fodder kept attacking the city walls. The ordinary elven army didn't dare to face the demon wave head-on. If it wasn't for the fact that the elves had activated their mage towers and mage squads to support them with long-range magic attacks, perhaps the outer city walls would have already been lost. They're using mags so quickly, it would seem that the demon wave will be even more difficult to deal with than expected. The elves are also stronger than expected. Harlois and I came to an agreement. We had both predicted that the elves would begin using their mags' power on the 3rd night. We never expected that they would use their mags on the very first night. This wasn't a good sign. The arrival of the demon wave had brought about a change in the elemental tide. Although the power of magic had increased exponentially, this exponential increase also meant that it would be more difficult for mags to control. Mags would need time to get used to the new high magic environment. If they were sent to battle now, it was likely that they would lose control and self-destruct due to nervousness. It wasn't always better to have more magic power. Spell models needed to be exquisitely designed, and not a single point could be out of balance. A fireball suddenly turning into a wall of fire or even a flame explosion wasn't necessarily a good thing on the battlefield either. Overly inflated elements and magic power were extremely dangerous to spellcasters. For example, if a child's power suddenly increased to that of an adult's, the child would definitely be the first to be injured. But if the child was given a few days to get used to it, and through all sorts of training and games, he would probably be able to control his body again. The tremendous increase in magic and elemental power was the same principle. 2 days and 48 hours was the time that our mags had estimated. For ordinary mags, even if they started meditating right now, they would still need to wait until then to be able to control their uncontrollable magic. Even mags from the mortal plane would need several days to get used to the environment when they entered a new dimension. This was common knowledge among mags. Fighting right away would likely be suicidal. It didn't require any high-level techniques to make this judgment. Mags' instincts and experience would warn them of the danger of losing control of their magic. Naturally, the elven mags would be able to make this judgment as well. Now that they were on the battlefield, either they were suicidal, or they needed a reason to attack. There's a hole in the outer city wall. Just the self-destruction of cannon fodder actually created a hole in the wall. Is this wall a second-hand contractor? Of course, I knew that the Moon Elves wouldn't hand over such an important city wall to an irresponsible contractor. However, a hole had appeared in the city wall, which was capable of withstanding cannon fire and war chariots, just like that. This was no different from destroying the city wall with mere physical bodies. That was far too ridiculous. Even without the important reason that mags needed time to get used to the environment, there were still other reasons for having the mags participate in the battle earlier. Mags had limited mana, and mage towers had limited mana pools. Entering the battlefield earlier would mean using up all of the mags' mana. Good steel should be used on the blade's edge. Using elite mags' mana in exchange for the death of some cannon fodder didn't seem worth it at all. It would seem that the elves don't want to lose the first layer of the outer city wall so easily. Losing the outer city wall on the first day might seem quite normal from a tactical standpoint, but the loss of morale had to be taken into consideration. The elves were currently in a hopeless situation with no hope of reinforcements. It would be necessary to be careful about maintaining the defending army's morale. In that case, the Silver Elves' charge was the only solution. The elven gods are probably going to interfere soon. How much longer will it take for us? If we can finish the modifications tonight, we'll be on our way as early as the night after tomorrow. However, it'll probably take another day for all the weapons, equipment, and mags to get used to them. It would seem that there was still enough time. Let's hope that the elves would do their best. It would be far too embarrassing if even the main god Donates didn't need to personally intervene, and the elves would be finished. And if Donates personally intervened, I really couldn't imagine how the elves would deal with him. Those rebels aren't that simple. Just relax and watch the show. The elven empress smiled like a flower as she spat out venomous venom. However, the person who understood you the most was often your enemy. Her words were quite convincing. All right, tell the mags to prioritize the new Borealis Mage Towers and complete the modifications. Perhaps they'll come in handy. Chapter 637. After an entire night of bitter battle, the elves finally managed to endure until dawn. However, demons weren't undead creatures. They weren't afraid of sunlight at all. In fact, the sunlight was even warmer and more comfortable than the sunlight from the Chaos Abyss, which made them instinctively feel joy and excitement. Since both demons and elves had night vision, there was no difference between night and day for both sides. Dawn arrived, but the battle in the Moonwheel capital was only becoming more and more intense. After an entire night of fierce battles, the defenders had to rest, eat, and sleep. High fatigue meant high battle losses. However, demons were single-use cannon fodder to begin with. The moment they were activated, their lifespan would begin ticking down, and their numbers were almost limitless. What was there to cherish? The elves needed food to replenish their supplies. The low-level cannon fodder demons had already lost all sense of reason. They had no concept of hunger at all. Even if they were starving, they would instinctively eat dirt and trees. When high-level demons were thirsty or hungry, they would simply find a random demon of their own species or opponent to eat. Crunchy, chicken-flavored. Fighting a battle of attrition against the demon's demon army? That would teach those bastards who only had muscles for brains what attrition was. Before the demons were completely destroyed, no objective factor would be able to stop them. After a long night, the forests around the Moonwheel capital's outskirts had become nothing more than rotten wastelands. The extravagant and sturdy outer city walls were now in tatters. The smell of blood and sulfur in the air was nauseating. The ground near the city walls was now completely dyed red. The smell of blood was so heavy that it was suffocating. This was the final remains of countless demon war slaves that had reached the end of their lives. The elves also suffered heavy losses. The Treants suffered heavy losses, and one of their trump cards, the Silver Elf Knight Squadron, lost 10% of its members. After the demon war slaves reached the city walls, the ordinary defenders had even more vicious battles against them. They were either swallowed alive by the demon war slaves or self-destructed and dragged to hell. Since they couldn't defeat the demons in melee combat, why not use ranged combat to exhaust them? That was indeed what the elves thought and did. However, the results were incredibly poor. The elves' melee warriors were more agile. They could only be considered third-rate meat shields. However, the elves had always been proud of their ranger squadrons. Very few species had established ranger squadrons. Their agile and light bodies, coupled with simple nature magic, not only could they buff themselves, but they could also recruit animal companions. Their sharp arrows, which could suddenly attack from nowhere, were the nightmares of any enemy who invaded the Rangers' territory. They were practically invincible in jungle warfare and guerrilla warfare. But this time, the archery that the Elven Rangers were so proud of had met with the most undefeatable opponent. Sharp arrows were indeed fatal to humanoid creatures. Just piercing through a vital point would be enough to take a life. However, to giants, human greatswords were nothing more than toothpicks. To demons with thick skin and flesh, Elves' arrows were nothing more than uncomfortable porcupine needles if they couldn't find a demon's vital point. The demon's vitals? That was a demon's greatest secret. Every demon had a different evolutionary path. Every demon had a different body structure. Naturally, their vitals would be different. Some demons had 3 hearts and 2 brains. However, only one was the most important. All the others could be regenerated. It would be meaningless to attack any one of them. Some demons even had their vitals in their lower limbs. Their heads and bodies were nothing more than decorations. The soles of their feet were their vitals. Agility-type warriors who focused on attacking vital spots in combat would probably least want to face off against creatures that had almost no vital spots. However, elementals, demons, undead creatures, and other non-physical creatures were all the same. In such a situation, they were often even weaker than the physically strong barbarians. Unfortunately, these magical creatures had already lost their sense of pain. Their large size meant that normal piercing attacks would be ineffective. In their brainless berserk state, they would have no concept of fear even if their heads were pierced. With all these factors combined, even if they were turned into target practice targets, they wouldn't be able to stop their advance. In the past, enchanted moonlight arrows and explosive arrows would be of great use in such a situation. However, these enchanted and enchanted magic arrows were incredibly expensive tactical resources. Using them on ordinary demons would be a waste. In the end, the elves' ranger squads, which they were so proud of, became nothing more than spectators on the battlefield. In fact, ranger generals even started forbidding the elves from casually shooting arrows in order to avoid wasting precious arrows. The melee elves had suffered far too heavy losses, and the long-range archers were far too ineffective. In the end, the moon elves could only helplessly use their mags as reinforcements. One night, just one night, and the elves were forced to use their mags and mana reserves. Fireballs exploded outside the city walls, and blizzards washed over all the demons on the city walls. A single night of bitter battle had used up more than 20% of all the mage tower's mana reserve. This didn't mean that the elves were in desperate straits. It simply meant that the elves' regular combat strength was far too weak against the demon cannon fodder. The tremendous first demon wave had forced the elves into a battle of attrition that gave them the greatest headache. Currently, the area between the outer city wall and the second city wall was filled with pitiful screams and pitiful scenes. Injured soldiers were being carried down from the city wall on stretchers. Those with only broken arms or legs were already considered lucky. The healers were doing their best to save them from death. The smell of blood, sweat, and sulfur mixed together. The stench was nauseating. But at this time, even the superior elves, who were usually the most picky about cleanliness, didn't have any reason to feel disgusted. Moon Elf Empress Athena's eyes were filled with sorrow as she watched everything unfold before her. All the ministers around her also remained silent. Nobody had expected that the outer city wall would be almost completely lost in just one night. When the Moonwheel Capital was designed, the Moonwheel Capital had been designed with a hypothetical human mega-empire surrounding it. The Moonwheel Capital would also need to buy enough time to wait for the elves' reinforcements. Yet, the Moonwheel Capital was so weak that it couldn't even withstand a single blow from the demon wave. The lightning defensive spell formation on the city wall had run out of energy. The magical vines that had been nurtured for over 100 years would kill all invaders, but the demons had eaten them all. The powerful mage towers and the game team's long-range reinforcements, they had used up too much energy and needed to be stopped. There were also ancient war trees planted by the city wall. The demon cube indicated that occasionally eating vegetables was quite good for one's stomach. Earth element mags buffed and repaired the city wall, but the repairs weren't as fast as the destruction. More than 1 or 2 earth element mags had been dragged out of the city wall after running out of mana. Hippogriffs, giant eagles, and the Pegasus Knights aerial reinforcements. In front of the endless cannon fodder formations, these reinforcements were no different from ground combat forces. Occasionally, some demon war slaves would suddenly appear and drag them down. Even the most intricate defensive spell formations and mechanisms would have their limits. The demons didn't even need to think of any way to break through them. A sufficient amount of cannon fodder would be more than enough to flatten everything. The current generation of elves finally understood why their ancestors had said that the first demon wave would be impossible to resist. A berserk demon war slave wouldn't be weak to begin with. Even if it lost its mind, it would obtain even greater power. However, such a warrior would have a weakness. If given enough time and space, even a silver-ranked warrior would be able to defeat a demon war slave without being injured. But when the demon war slaves' numbers reached an almost limitless number, when these berserk warriors appeared on the battlefield where one could only advance and not retreat, they would naturally become meat reapers. It seems that it's only a matter of time before the city falls. Everyone had such doubts. However, nobody dared to say it out loud. It seemed that no matter what trump card the elves used, the demon war slaves would simply use cannon fodder to flatten everything. When will reinforcements arrive? Athena muttered to herself in a daze. However, nobody dared to answer her. That was because all of the elves' reinforcements were already here. The only reinforcements outside had a rather special status. In the end, the Silver Elf Grand Knight Captain, General, who had the most special status of all the elves, could only brace himself and speak up. Your Majesty, the latest contact we received said that the earliest would be the night after tomorrow. Didn't they say that they would arrive this afternoon? Could it be that those bastards who took advantage of the situation still intend to threaten us at this time? Those bastards, we've already agreed to their shameless conditions. What else do they want? Could it be that they intend to increase the price? Those shameless and despicable bastards. Athena could still be considered a young elf among the elves. However, her noble bloodline and outstanding political abilities made her quite famous. But now, her hysterical attitude was really damaging to her former image. They said that the elemental tide is attacking our airships. Our mags and equipment need time to adjust. Our mags said that this is indeed necessary preparation work. Last night, several of our mage towers were permanently damaged, and 2 archmages even died. The elves also knew what would happen if they forcefully ordered the mags to cast spells. However, they still gave such a cruel order last night. After all, losing the outer city walls on the very first night would be a tremendous blow to the elves' morale. Perhaps it was because there were outsiders present, or perhaps it was because screaming released too much pressure, but Athena's expression calmed down quite a bit. Please ask them to send reinforcements as soon as possible. We shall continue to make concessions. Even if it's a day faster, no, half a day faster would be fine. Their heavy words were filled with unwillingness. Nobody had expected things to turn out this way. However, this heavy reality had dealt a heavy blow to the elves' self-confidence. Their secret confidence of we'll definitely be able to defeat the demon wave, and perhaps even counterattack the chaos abyss had finally vanished into thin air. We're unable to stop the demon wave by ourselves. Alright then, the elves were finally admitting that they were unable to deal with the demon wave. Actually, due to the lack of information across all continents, this type of seemingly inconceivable secret confidence was quite common. No matter how powerful other elves' armies sounded, they were still other elves' armies, and would be useless paper tigers. Even if the entire world said that the elves' treasured armies were no match for the elves, they would still believe that the elves' armies were capable of doing so. Some of the elves' confidence was created because of propaganda and espionage. Some of the elves told lies to give the elves confidence. Even the elves' leaders themselves began to believe them. Even if the enemy is indeed stronger than us, our warriors aren't to be trifled with. Perhaps we'll be able to win. Actually, this type of foolish behavior had been used on countless battlefields. Usually, this type of secret confidence would vanish without a trace after a single battle. If the elves were to make concessions right now, it would be the equivalent of giving the elves an exorbitant price. At the very least, the full moon elven empire would no longer be able to maintain its orthodoxy. Your Majesty, our ancestors' ideals, the gods' ambitions. They won't want to see this. We can't, Your Majesty, we can't. The elves all began to express their loyalty. Some elves were even angrily glaring at their empress, as if they were watching their unfilial descendants selling off their family's property. But actually, most elves were inwardly delighted. Someone was finally going to take the blame. At any rate, all they had to do was change their empress, which was an acceptable ending. Meanwhile, Athena herself would most likely become a sacrifice for the change of generation. Actually, from the moment that she decided to migrate, she was already destined to become a sinner of the full moon elven empire. No, our elves finally managed to break free from their shackles. We don't need to wag our tails and beg the elves' descendant. Suddenly, a deep voice interrupted the elves' discussion. When I looked up, I saw a hazy figure wearing a silver mage robe with a halo of light revolving behind him. His holy appearance made him seem as if he was the incarnation of a god. Dimensional doors leading to the upper planes opened up around him. Divine envoys from the heavens, the elf Valkyrie, and divine beasts surrounded by starlight all walked out of these dimensional doors. The elven gods had interfered. Back on the floating battleship, I had chatted with Harlois about this battle situation. With the elven gods here, they probably won't die too quickly. At the very least, they should be able to last until we arrive. I'm just worried that if the elven gods interfere, they might die even faster. Just look, with the elven gods interfering, would Donates still be able to slack off? That means they'll probably die even faster, right? Just as I expected, the black giant was able to stand up and pick up his obsidian greatsword that was stained with the god's blood when that figure of light appeared. Finally, there was a worthy prey. Chapter 638. The blood-red moonlight guided our way. The high density of the Chaos Abyss's pollution caused all our indicators to be off the charts. Even the most optimistic person would feel tense as they looked at the stampede of beasts on the ground. This was already the third day since the demon wave's eruption. According to the original plan, we were supposed to arrive tonight. However, plans were meant to be changed. We also met with several interceptions along the way. It would be quite fortunate if we could arrive before tomorrow morning. It could be seen that the winged demons and magic dragons weren't attacking us at all. They were probably just flying magic beasts in the demon wave attacking us on their own. That was because the few flying magic beasts attacking the airships all seemed like they were simply sending themselves to die. Airships didn't even need to be sent out. The airships on the airships would have already shot them down. Those seemingly powerful magic dragons were actually Chaos Abyss variants of wyverns and other semi-dragons. Perhaps the demon wave had given them stronger bodies, but it hadn't given them the brains to avoid danger or fight in the air. These flying magic beasts didn't pose any threat to us, but they did indeed slow down our speed. Sending out scouts and adjusting the airship's engine several times caused us to be 4 or 5 hours slower than we had expected. As for Athena's message to me saying, "You can do whatever you want if you arrive earlier," I just treated it as nothing more than a joke. Such verbal promises weren't very convincing to begin with. Plus, it would be quite likely that Athena would go back on her word. I didn't want to take even greater risks for the sake of unreliable benefits, so I ordered the airship pilot to prioritize safety and stability. As for whether or not it would make the elves waste more of the demon wave's energy in order to make our arrival more valuable, would anyone believe me if I said no? Harlois was quite supportive of my idea of safety-first piloting. I felt that she just wanted to see more of her enemies die. Otherwise, it would be quite difficult to deal with the elves' subordinates. The ground beneath us was now pitch black. The densely packed magical beasts on the ground would cause one's scalp to go numb. It seemed that the demon wave didn't even take the Elven Emperor's capital seriously, and was only minding its own business as it spread its existence. It was likely that the surrounding human kingdom's hopes had been dashed. Even if the elves were completely wiped out, it was likely that they wouldn't be able to waste much of the demon wave's energy. As I stood in the airship's flight deck's hallway and looked at the sky, there was something that I would never forget. Are you still thinking about last night's meteor shower? I hope that we didn't come here for nothing. Meteor shower? It was probably a group of god meteors. I was becoming more and more pessimistic about the elves' chances. Last night, 4 gigantic dark white meteors fell from the sky. All the eyewitnesses instantly understood that they were god meteors. The new information was quickly delivered. 2 weak follower gods and 1 mid-level god had fallen. Their priesthoods were music, pilgrim, guide of the lost in the forest, and enlightener of the artists, And there was still one missing. It was a lesser god, a follower of the god of art. It didn't participate in the battle, and it fell as its faith fell. It could be said that the small team of the elven god system's art god system had been completely annihilated. There were approximately 13 true gods in the elven god faction. However, only 2 of them were powerful gods. One of them was the Silver Elves' guardian war god Sonya, and the other was the Moon Elves' god of worship, Somulin. Sonya was one of the stronger gods, and her divine concepts included war, protection of the brave, and protection of rangers. Somulin had always kept a low profile and had a close relationship with Anslo. It was said that he was originally a follower god of Anslo, and his divine concepts included religion. Actually, he was only the supervisor of elven religious rituals, nature's guardian, and elven family pathfinder. Many Druil worshipped this powerful god of the nature faction. The elven gods weren't completely united. The wood elves' true gods counted as neutral in the nature faction. As for the dark elves, it seemed that their entire army had been wiped out. The silver elves' true gods' small team was more focused on war and protection. These gods who had nothing to do with war were naturally Somulin's subordinates. The moon elves had a good relationship with the moon elves. Their low belief meant that they were in danger. Now that the moon elves were facing a fatal threat, the moon elves' belief was about to run out. Since they weren't skilled at fighting and had to force their way out, it was only natural that their entire army would be wiped out. Challenging Donates in the middle of the demon wave? That would be the same as challenging a main god in a divine kingdom. Any existence below the level of a powerful god would never be able to escape unscathed. But if Donates truly chose to attack, then who would be able to stop him? It was unknown whether or not my preparations would be effective. The only thing I could hope for was that Donates wouldn't be interested in the ordinary elves. But even if he didn't attack, the demon wave would be more than capable of destroying everything. From a certain standpoint, when the first demon wave of the Chaos Abyss chose the elves' territory as the breakthrough point, everything before them had already become a foregone conclusion. This was a battle where there was no hope of victory. The difference between the Chaos Abyss and the elves was far too great. The elves had lost far too much in terms of overall strategy. No matter how hard the elves worked, they would only be able to obtain short-term tactical victories. Looking at the overall situation, the elves would only be able to minimize their losses, which wouldn't be of much use. Although this was cruel, this was war. Boom. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion in the distance as a brilliant golden pillar of light appeared in the sky. This was the light of pure mana. The shockwave and wind from this pillar of light messed up the elves' battle formation. I opened my eyes and felt a piercing pain in my eyes. Meanwhile, everyone else around me was already clutching their heads and collapsing. This pure mana light had already surpassed the ability to look directly at it. A forbidden spell? Impossible. Donates wouldn't give them any time to prepare. If they start to prepare a forbidden spell, Donates will unhesitatingly launch an all-out attack, which will cause them to die even faster. Then what is this? Every single spell's mana level was over the limit. With such a powerful magical shockwave, it was likely that it truly reached the level of a forbidden spell. Instantly casting a forbidden spell? Not to mention whether or not it was even possible, the elves wouldn't have been forced into such dire straits if they were truly capable of such a feat in that case. The most likely possibility was a fragment of divine power crystal. I never expected that they would actually succeed. The person who understood you the most would forever be your enemy. Harlois actually knew what that was. The elves' belief in the gods is completely different from that of humans. The elves' understanding of the gods is more similar to that of mags. They've long since snuck into the gods' forbidden zone. The moon elves had always been in charge of religion back in the old elven empire. The moon elves' understanding of the gods had a long history. The moon elves' divine power crystal was an attempt to use mortal items to restrain divine power so that mortals could use divine power. If it was possible to store divine power like a mana pool, then faith would become another form of currency. From a certain standpoint, the elves were indeed daring enough to do such a thing. In the past, any divine job class member would have to obtain a blessing from a true god in order to obtain divine arts. The number of divine arts they could obtain would definitely be limited. After all, the power of faith would definitely be used to strengthen the gods themselves. This was similar to how the gods' public expenditure would definitely be less than half of the annual tax revenue. The gods would also need to ensure a balance of income and development. The amount of divine arts and divine power bestowed upon them would depend on the gods' mood and how much they favored their divine job class member. If the moon elves could store divine power in a fixed container like Olivia's magic box, perhaps they would still be able to use divine arts even without the gods. Theoretically speaking, the moon elves' power would be greatly increased. And if they succeeded, the moon elves' priests would also have nearly limitless divine arts, but this would obviously enrage all the gods. From a foundational standpoint, this would be no different from a desecration priest who stole divine power. No, considering that if divine power could be stored, traded, and turned into a form of currency, the gods' unpredictability would be greatly reduced. The gods' loftiness and status would be seriously challenged. Perhaps this would be even worse than desecrating priests. They're so reckless. Do the elven gods really allow them to do as they please? This was a research project of the Gold Elves back in the day. It's just that the Moon Elves took over. Harloy's words were filled with regret. The Gold Elves had once again demonstrated what it meant by reckless behavior, and suicidal behavior would result in death. I didn't even need to explain how Harloy's knew about this. She had a large number of students and spies in the mage country. How could she possibly have fewer spies among the elves? Considering how the Moon Elves had been planning this for at least several thousand years, it was likely that some of the elf subordinates had already reached the upper echelons. In that case, it was quite easy to understand what was happening. The Moon Elves were forced into a corner, so they used their trump card and detonated their divine power. Pure positive energy would be incredibly destructive against demons. However, this was a double-edged sword. Even if the Moon Elves survived this current crisis, the human order gods wouldn't let the Moon Elves off. The fairies' latest announcement. The god of sacrifice, Somulon, descended to the mortal world in his true form, but was still seriously injured by Denotes. His true god body self-detonated, and he perish. Alright then, it would seem that our earlier judgment had been smacked in the face. That wasn't some sort of divine power crystal at all. That was obviously a true god's final holy light. By the way, even I had never seen a powerful god's divine power explode before their death. So this was what it looked like. Harloy's. After the pillar of light exploded, a gigantic white meteor tore through the sky. That was a divine kingdom fragment that had already lost all meaning. I looked for Harloy's with interest, intending to see her current expression. Just now, she had been so confident in her deduction, but now, she had been instantly proven wrong. Somulon died. Then we really need to have a proper celebration. No, we're going to have the grandest party tonight. Alcohol is forbidden on the battlefield. No, we're doing this for a grand funeral. Harloy's was overjoyed to the point where she didn't know which way was north. The other superior elf leaders all had awkward expressions, but it wasn't appropriate for them to stop her. I had almost forgotten that Harloy's had so many enemies in the elf god faction. Since Somulon was so close to Anslo, it was likely that he was one of Harloy's greatest enemies as well. As for her misjudgment just now, she didn't care about it anymore since her enemy had died. I could only helplessly shake my head as I watched Harloy's go crazy and really intend to have a party with all the superior elves. It would seem that she trusts you quite a bit. Dedina's sudden appearance made me feel rather uncomfortable. She was a Chaos Lord, after all. I had always sent someone to carefully follow her. She had also played her part quite well. She's still in the mood to mess around at such a critical moment. Of course she trusts that you'll be able to handle the current situation. It's just that she doesn't know that we're about to face Denotes. You'll see. I didn't say anything else. Even if Dedina's identity was rather special, trust would still take time to build up. Bringing her along was already giving her enough face. It was even more impossible for her to reveal my upcoming battle plan. This wasn't because I was on guard. It was simply a necessary caution of an old fox. Some things would always be better if others knew as little as possible. I could understand why Didina was worried about the elves. However, I didn't intend on giving her an explanation. In that case, can you tell me how you intend to lead the elves in escaping from the demon wave? It seems that these airships alone won't be enough. Of course it wouldn't be enough. The Moonwheel capital had the entire population of the Elven Empire. Even if the airships were fully loaded, there definitely wouldn't be enough. In fact, there wouldn't even be enough for the children and elderly. Not to mention, the elves wouldn't be able to leave by themselves, and I wouldn't be able to return empty-handed. But if I led the elves in a large migration to open a path through the demon wave, that would be far too beautiful a scene. Have you heard of the Herit Mountains? Do you intend to cross that precipice? However, it'll take several days to make the trip back and forth. If you repeatedly transport the elves, traversing through the human kingdoms layer by layer would be both time-consuming and dangerous. The Herit Mountains were treated as an insurmountable mountain range. The demon wave probably wouldn't be foolish enough to climb the snowy mountains. In that case, it would naturally be safe to cross the Herit Mountains. My goal was only to help the elves survive this calamity. I would simply leave them behind, and I could bring the young elves with potential to the Northlands. As for how I would lead the elves to cross the demon wave and cross the impossible-to-pass mountain range, that would be my own problem. I smiled and nodded at Didina's worry. I didn't say anything else as I directly got up and said goodbye. When I calculated the time, it was indeed about time. From now until I reached my destination, I would have about 24 hours to prepare. Excuse me. I still have some personal matters to take care of. After saying goodbye, I directly headed to the Borealis Mage Tower. The modifications had begun the moment I left. By now, the preparations should have been completed. In that case, let me prepare a present for Donates. I wonder what the elves will think when they see my present. It should be quite interesting. Chapter 639. At dawn on the 10th of December, the third morning of the demon wave's eruption, the entire region had been contaminated by the chaos abyss. The elves had been forced into a corner. The blood moon had once again taken control of the world. The elves had been forced to use one trump card after another, while the Chaos faction had only icily sent out even more cannon fodder. Even if the elves didn't pay attention to the battle situation here, the meteor shower that would occur every few hours was an undeniable reality. The gods were constantly falling like meteors. The elven gods were finished. A god didn't only need astonishing natural talent and great luck. A god would need to establish his own divine kingdom as he or she matured. In that case, the god species and mortals who recognized the god's teachings would form the god's faction in the mortal plane. Their faith in life and their souls in death would all help the god's growth. This was why the gods in the Ashi continent were usually limited to species. Every god had been raised by the resources of countless species. History had given the god such a status, but that didn't mean that the god's efforts to reach the peak couldn't be denied. It seemed quite logical that a god would become stronger if a species was stronger. But what was even more logical was that a god would become stronger if a species was stronger. The two faintly supported each other. Most mortals wouldn't be able to understand this, but the true gods and powerful individuals would all understand. That was why the elven gods definitely wouldn't allow the Moonwheel capital to fall. That would mean that all of the elven gods would be kicked out of the god's domain, which would mean that countless years of accumulated faith would go up in smoke. From a different perspective, if the elven gods all died or more than half died, even the Moonwheel capital elves wouldn't be able to accept such an ending. That would mean that they would become a third-rate species without any god's protection. After the Beastman Empire and the Beastman gods died, the Beastmen that were driven to the Northlands and the Underground were the best evidence. From the very start, I had never worried that the elven gods wouldn't intervene, even if that would only lead to certain death. That was how it was like to believe in a god. Success was due to belief, and failure was also due to belief. While the elven gods enjoyed the worship of their believers, they were also bound by their beliefs. We had already met true inferno dragons on our way here. These inferno dragons were a type of true dragon that had evolved after choosing the path of the chaos abyss. These berserk creatures had also come to the mortal plane to enjoy new flesh and blood. This was doubtlessly adding insult to injury. True dragons were also a high-level combat strength in the Chaos Abyss. Seeing several Inferno dragons together was probably no coincidence. It was most likely that some demon lord had intentionally brought them here to strengthen the demon wave's aerial combat strength. Ever since 10 hours ago, when I started a preparatory work, our fleet's speed had slowed down even more. This wasn't because we were slacking off. Rather, we were meeting more and more obstacles. Previously, the demon wave had ignored our existence. But now, even the berserkers on the ground wanted to jump up and bite us. The Ice Age era is about to descend. A new era will bring about a new era. The chanting reverberated through the heavens and the earth. Countless snowflakes fell from the sky, and the surface of our battleship was already covered in snow. Even snow. Moon. Even. Of moon, God. As moon was. Ocean. God. Gods, moon. God. Even though they were prepared, the engineers and crew members were still shivering in the cold. They could only find cotton-padded clothes and coats to wrap themselves up. That's right. I needed 24 hours to prepare for Emperor Yungya's signature spell, the forbidden spell Ice Aeon. As I mentioned before, the biggest difference after entering Myth rank was that I was now only one step away from reaching the peak of Semigod rank. Although I couldn't cast the complete version of Ice Aeon, a simplified version was no problem. Forbidden spells could be cast at least at the Legend rank. The various lower-leveled versions were always Mag's greatest weapons. Law magic had the special effect of forcefully increasing one's power level. With Harloy's and the Mage Tower's assistance, I was already 3/4 done with the channeling of the forbidden spell. Considering that my current bloodline and power level far surpassed my previous generation's power level, as well as the increased power of magic due to the high magic level, this simplified version of Ice Aeon wouldn't be any weaker than the complete version from back in the day. Actually, there was no point in thinking about this. In terms of destructive power, hydrogen bombs were vastly different from nuclear bombs. However, it would be quite difficult for those who were hit to find any difference. Deal with an ocean of cannon fodder? I guess we can only use AoE spells, large-scale AoE attacks. The elves had forbidden spell mags as well, but they definitely wouldn't be so foolish as to use one. That would be the equivalent of forcing the enemy to risk their lives at all costs. The stronger the forbidden spell, the longer the preparation time needed. 3 hours was considered a small forbidden spell, and 24 hours wasn't that long either. I was quite far away. Those magical beasts that had lost all sense of reason could sense the threat of the powerful elemental waves. They would instinctively attack the airship fleet, making our warriors run for their lives. Of course they'll risk their lives. Otherwise, it'll be the equivalent of suicide. From a certain standpoint, it was far too dirty to have a mage tower on an airship. Perhaps it was only to give the airship the ability to defend against magical attacks. However, if a forbidden spell mage was installed on the airship, these nuclear weapons would be able to move around, allowing the long preparation time for the forbidden spell to be cast in a relatively safe location. The threat would be more than 10 times greater. On a certain planet, a nuclear weapon explosion wouldn't be much of a threat. That was because its range was even shorter than the explosion's radius. Immobilized bombs that were too powerful would only end up being used to destroy everything. But when nuclear weapons were combined with strategic bombers and intercontinental missiles, that would give nuclear weapons the ability to move around, greatly increasing their deterrence. Only then would they truly be a strategic threat. Casting a forbidden spell would require a long period of concentration. It would be impossible to cast a forbidden spell with the strength of a mount. Not only would the Mage Tower have a gravity balancing device, there would also be all sorts of supporting devices. The airship's Mage Tower would provide an excellent platform for casting spells. What? Why didn't I use the floating city or the cloud tower? Those things' movement speed. I might as well forget about them. Perhaps the future will be an era where airships and forbidden spell mags will fight each other. The long casting time made me feel rather fatigued. Fortunately, we had our soul connection, so I could chat with Harloy's to relieve my fatigue. I could also keep track of the latest developments. That won't happen. Nobody's an idiot. You'll be on guard after playing with this a few times. What do you think you'll do if a few semigod assassins jump out while you're casting? What would I do? I would kill myself right in front of you. Casting a forbidden spell was a double-edged sword. Just the mana recoil from interrupting the spell would be enough to cause me to self-destruct. Right now, I couldn't move or speak, so I was nothing more than a human punching bag. Harloise's words were indeed reasonable. Doing something like this once was fine, but doing it a few more times would definitely cause others to think of ways to kill you. Still, it wasn't as if what she said was completely meaningless. It would be fine to use a forbidden spell for 3 hours to bully an enemy that didn't have an airship fleet or a flying squadron. How much longer until the stable period? About 3 hours. We'll arrive at the Moonwheel capital around that time. That's perfect timing. Did you already expect to be intercepted? Not at all. I just habitually stayed back for a few extra hours as preparation. Actually, that's not the important part. Yeah, the important part is the final explosive period. That's the most dangerous part. Casting a forbidden spell and casting a normal spell were two completely different concepts. Not only would a forbidden spell require the caster's own mana, but it would also require borrowing the power of the world and the elemental tide to explode in one go. It would have high requirements for the caster, and the spellcasting process wouldn't allow for any mistakes. The first step would be to prepare beforehand. You would need to construct the spell's model and prepare mana reserves. Only after repeatedly confirming that the spell was in place would you begin casting the spell. Based on the mag's habits, this was the only safe preparation period. The second step would naturally be the long incantation period. At this time, countless elemental spirits would be summoned, and the elemental power would be rearranged according to the caster's will. Some would gradually compress, while others would form magic arrays. Finally, the elemental energy would transform into an intricate spell model, entering a relatively stable state. During this period, the final forbidden spell's spell model would take shape and be ready to be cast. This period of time would be called the stable period. And the most dangerous part was the third step, which was also the last step, the explosive period. Casting the spell model wouldn't be an instantaneous process. In order to move the power of the entire world, the spell model would need to be connected to the surrounding environment and nature, and move the entire world's power to destroy the enemy. This casting process wouldn't be instantaneous. And, since the spell model would be connected to the surrounding world, the caster definitely wouldn't be able to move. In fact, it would be difficult for them to even be distracted. Since I was going to cast the forbidden spell in the Moonwheel capital, it was only natural that I would have to enter the final explosive period in the Moonwheel capital, and I would still have to face Donates himself. How long will it take? 10 minutes shouldn't be a problem. There's good news and bad news. I don't want to know either. Cough. The good news is that with so many positive factors, such as my understanding of ice and snow, the Ice Mage Tower's support, and so on, this forbidden spell's power level shouldn't be any weaker than the original. Its destructive power might even surpass the original. The bad news is that the explosive period will take longer than expected. How long? Harloi's voice was filled with impatience. At a time like this, every minute represented endless threats and variables. At least half an hour, at most 3 hours. Is it too late to stop right now? If you want to watch my fleet get blown up along with me, that's fine. You want to stall Donates and the demon wave for 3 hours? I'm going to go all out against you. Cough, cough, stop messing around. You'll blow up. While playing with Harlois to pass time, I was also secretly praying. Since I was destined to face the demon wave, how could I possibly not have made my preparations? However, man proposes, God disposes. Whether or not my prepared plans would succeed would depend on how smart I was. I had seen far too many situations where I ended up killing myself. The people and matters involved would be far too complicated. I really didn't have complete confidence. It's fortunate that Eliza succeeded. Otherwise, she would have died such a pitiful death. Chapter 640. When we fought against the Moonwheel capital, even the bravest warrior could only gasp in shock. We had never underestimated the demon wave's destructive power, but we still discovered that we had underestimated its existence. The originally beautiful and holy White Moon City in our information was now nothing more than a pile of broken bricks. The magical forest that had been filled with endless mysteries and dangers was now nothing more than a wasteland. The Moonwheel Capital's 5-layered city wall was now down to its final 2 layers. Not only were the commoners fighting for their lives, even the Empress and her ministers had brought their maids to the front lines of the battle. Red bloodstains could be seen everywhere between the broken city walls. The ground was dyed red, and the demons had long since devoured any minced meat. In the periphery of the final shelter, there was nothing but densely packed demons and magical beasts of various colors. The demons were driven by the chaos abyss to devour everything before them. Perhaps they would self-destruct after the demon wave reached its end, but before that, they would be an unstoppable flood. We appeared together with a heavy snowfall. Heavy snow was falling from the sky. Although it was quite an artistic scene, the next instant, the violent ice elemental fluctuations seemed to turn on a full-screen mockery as everyone's gazes were focused on us. What did it feel like to be stared at by 100 people? What did it feel like to be stared at by 1,000 people? What did it feel like to be stared at by hundreds of thousands or even millions of murderous gazes? For an instant, the entire world stopped moving. But the next instant, everything came to life again. All the demons unhesitatingly stopped attacking the Moonwheel Capital and charged towards us. The sky was filled with countless bees, while the ground was filled with an endless swarm of ants. Just looking at this would make one's scalp numb. Then, I felt despair when I thought about how each and every one of these demons was powerful and capable of madly self-destructing. The demons on the ground actually started climbing each other, creating human ladders to attack us. But right after that, an angry roar echoed throughout the sky. "Anslow, stop them if you don't want the moon elves to be wiped out." That's right, I made arrangements in the chaos abyss. I had Eliza go to Anslow and have him stop Donates in the middle of the demon wave. Anslow would be our meat shield. I meant personally saving the moon elves. While it would indeed be quite difficult for a main god to descend to the mortal plane, this was currently the time of the demon wave. The dimensional cracks would be completely opened up. I doubted that there would be anything on the other side of the chaos abyss that would stop a chaos main god from coming here. All I did was have Eliza send a message to Anslow and point him in the right direction. All main god level existences were individuals that surpassed all common sense. I didn't know if the elven god's death and the Moonwheel Capital's destruction would also cause Roland to perish. But seeing how Roland was willing to join the Chaos Abyss in order to protect the elves, it was obvious that he definitely wouldn't let go. Was this a trap? Indeed, how could a main god possibly win against the demon wave that was in despair and Donates who was at the peak of his power? It was still possible to defeat a main god, but it was almost impossible to kill a main god. Only in this kind of battlefield where one had to fight to the death could a main god fall. Anslow, come out. Your people are waiting for you to save them. If you have the ability to rebel against the gold elves, then pretend that you didn't see it. The God King of the elven gods. All the gods under your command have already perished, and the last of your believers are in a desperate situation. Do you have the ability to continue being a coward? Harlois revealed a delighted smile as her voice filled with evil intentions echoed throughout the entire world. The number one person on her list of revenge targets was naturally the mastermind behind the Gold Elves' destruction, main god Anslow. I promised her that I would kill Anslow, so I did as I promised. This was both revenge for history and hope for the future. Anslow had ruled the elves for far too long. If he didn't perish, not only would the Northland's elves be unable to peacefully belong to a new main god empire, they would definitely be punished by Anslow after the Holy War ended. Becoming a main god's mortal enemy would be an endless source of trouble. Besides, Cavendish hadn't chosen the wrong opponent. Anslow was also my mortal enemy. Since the elves are going to be saved, then Anslow must die. Was this a scheme? Of course it was. But considering how Harlois had already made it obvious, inviting you into the trap seemed more like an open scheme. No, it seemed more like a trade. If the Moon Elves were destined to be wiped out, Anslo might not necessarily come out to die with them. But now, I was giving you a chance to save the Moon Elves, but you had to risk your life against a powerful enemy. What would you choose? Was this a chance to save the elves? Yes, as long as I blocked Netis and had enough time to complete Ice Eon, perhaps the main god-level existences would be able to defend against my forbidden spell. However, the most troublesome Chaos War slaves would definitely be completely annihilated. In that case, there would be a chance of survival. But right now, Anslo had to face the elite Chaos Demon Lords, the furious Chaos War gods, and countless Chaos War slaves by himself, blocking their path to survival. Anslo was already injured to begin with. How many chances would he have of surviving? My forbidden spell didn't have eyes. Perhaps it wouldn't be able to kill a main god, but it would definitely be able to land a killing blow. And even if Anslo was lucky enough to survive. Although Aishi was large, there would be no place for Anslo if he betrayed the Order faction and then betrayed the Chaos faction right before the Holy War began. If the scales of life and death were placed in front of Anslo for him to choose, what would he do? I was the venerated elf main god Anslo, the protector and protector of all elves, the supreme god of radiant light. The destroyer of the Elven Empire. Please save us, elf main god. Please save us, venerated and venerated elf main god. Prayers could be heard from the Moonwheel capital's final line of defense. My spies and the despairing elves were all chanting the elf main god's name, praying for the elf main god to appear once more. The Moon Elf higher-ups all had rather grim expressions. The Moon Elf priests and other holy job class members were even cursing out loud. With the current situation before them, they naturally knew that this was a trap specifically targeted at the elf main god. However, many priests knelt down and piously prayed for the elf main god to descend. That was because this was the elven god's final land of faith. All the elven gods would perish if they lost the elves here. For the sake of the elves' faith and culture, please save us. Actually, the meaning behind these words would be easier to understand. Lord main god, please die so that we can survive. Save us. We still have a future. Anslo, please die. The glory of the elves still needs to continue. Our species can't perish here. Anslo, please die. Venerated elf main god, we believe that you'll definitely be able to destroy the demon wave before us. Please hurry up and die. Of course Anslo would be able to hear the prayers of the gods. The malicious curses mixed in with the seemingly sincere prayers were true poisons to Anslo. Mortals want to live, so they want the gods to die. This scene is so moving that I'm about to cry tears of joy. Unfortunately, right now, I could only share my joy with Harlois through our soul connection. Harlois was already hysterically excited through our soul connection. Yay, die, 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 die. Alright then, it would be more appropriate to describe Anslo as insane. However, it was time to vent the hatred that had accumulated for tens of thousands of years. What would Anslo do? What would he choose? Would he be a true saint? Would he be a hypocrite? It would all be meaningless. He was already finished. Anslo appeared and died. The old elven god's backbone was broken. The other main gods wouldn't let go of such a fat piece of meat. They would allow Anslo to safely survive the Holy War. The elven gods were finished. Since Anslo didn't appear, I unhesitatingly opened up the land of Hades and had the forbidden spell on my airship activate there. Then, I turned around and ran. As for the Moon Elves who had a grudge against me, anyone could save them. If Anslo didn't appear, I would definitely die here. Naturally, I would prioritize self-preservation. I could use this as an excuse to explain to the Northlands elves that I had tried my best, but I was sorry. If a god faction's god king didn't appear even after all his follower gods had perished and his believers were all dead, then he would be destined to die. Not a single elf would ever believe in such a guardian god again. Perhaps Anslo, who had the divine concept of protector of all elves, would end up in a fate even worse than death. Perhaps the elves would still be able to survive, but the elven gods were destined to die. Anslo, it's a dead end here. What will you choose? What can you choose? The gigantic figure that appeared in the sky had a silent and fatigued expression. It seemed to indicate his choice.